The restaurant was buzzing with the sound of clinking glasses and low murmurs. It was a typical Friday night, and Victor's upscale eatery was packed with diners in their best clothes, sipping wine and enjoying the lavish dishes. The dim lights and the soft jazz playing in the background created a cozy atmosphere, a place where people came to unwind and indulge. But tonight, the atmosphere was about to change. Miss Clara Walker, an elegant woman in her late 70s, sat quietly at a corner table, her hands folded neatly on the tablecloth. Her wrinkles told a story of years lived with grace, dignity, and resilience. Her life had been full of ups and downs, but tonight, she was simply looking for a peaceful evening to enjoy a meal. A hot bowl of clam chowder, a glass of water, and the calm of the restaurant were all she needed. But peace, as it turned out, was not on the menu. Victor had been watching the tables all evening from behind the bar, his sharp eyes scanning the crowd. He prided himself on his restaurant, often boasting about how exclusive it was. He didn't cater to just anyone. People had to meet his standards to dine at his establishment. Tonight, however, something about Miss Clara caught his attention. She wasn't a regular. She didn't belong in the polished, upscale crowd he'd cultivated. He didn't like the idea of an elderly black woman sitting in his restaurant alone, her presence, in his mind, almost a disruption to the perfect atmosphere he'd worked so hard to create. He decided that it was time to take action. Without a second thought, Victor approached Miss Clara's table with a forced smile. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, his voice polite but laced with an underlying edge. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave. You see, we have a very specific clientele here, and it's simply not the right fit for you." Miss Clara looked up at him, her expression unchanged. There was no fear in her eyes, just a calm dignity that made the words sting even more. "I'm sorry, what?" she asked softly. Victor's smile faltered for a moment, but he quickly regained his composure. "I said, I need you to leave. Now, you've been here long enough, and it's clear you're not welcome." Miss Clara's grip tightened on the edge of her water glass, but she didn't raise her voice. "I've paid for my meal," she said, her tone steady. "I haven't caused any trouble. I'm entitled to stay here like anyone else." Victor's patience was wearing thin. He turned his back on her, gesturing toward one of the waiters. "Get security," he ordered. "Now." Miss Clara's calm demeanor didn't waver. She knew what this moment was about. It wasn't about her behavior. It was about her being in a space where she wasn't wanted. But she wasn't going to let that happen. "You don't get to treat me like this," Miss Clara said, her voice growing louder now. "You think you can push me around because I'm an old woman? Well, I won't have it. I've fought too long and hard for my dignity to let people like you take it from me." As her words rang out through the restaurant, a few heads turned. The murmurs began to grow, and for a split second, Victor hesitated. But then, as if trying to salvage control, he snapped his fingers at the security guard who had appeared at the door. "Ma'am, you're going to have to leave," the security guard said, his tone much firmer than necessary. Miss Clara rose slowly from her seat, straightening her back. She wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing her cower. She gathered her purse and took one last look around the room, her eyes scanning the faces of the other diners who were now staring at her. Most were silent, a few uncomfortable, but none of them moved to stop what was happening. And then, in the back corner, Dwayne Johnson, known to many as The Rock, sat sipping his drink, quietly observing the scene unfold. He wasn't just another celebrity dining in the restaurant tonight. He was a man who had built his career on fighting for what was right. And what he saw unfolding in front of him was not something he could ignore. His gaze locked onto Miss Clara for a moment. The tension in the room, the way she stood tall, unbroken, despite the injustice, stirred something deep within him. He knew he couldn't stay silent anymore. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Miss Clara Walker had never been one to shrink from a challenge. Born in the Deep South in the early 1940s, she had witnessed and endured more injustice than most people could ever imagine. She wasn't born with riches, connections, or the luxury of opportunities that so many took for granted. But she had something stronger, a spirit that refused to be crushed, no matter the odds. As a little girl, Clara often watched her mother stand tall in the face of adversity. Her mother, a proud and fierce woman, taught Clara how to navigate a world that was often hostile to black people. It wasn't just about surviving, but about holding on to your dignity and demanding respect, even when others tried to take it away. Your worth, Clara, is not defined by what others think of you, her mother would say. It's defined by how you see yourself. Never forget that. That lesson had shaped Clara's life. Clara's first real taste of racial injustice came when she was just a teenager. She had been on her way to the local library, one she'd always been proud of for its collection of African American history books, when a white police officer stopped her on the street. She was simply walking, minding her own business, but the officer had other plans. He asked her why she was out here and told her to move along. But Clara refused to be intimidated. She stood her ground, her 16-year-old voice steady as she told the officer she had every right to be there, just as anyone else did. The officer didn't take kindly to her defiance and had her escorted to the police station. That moment, though painful and frightening, was the first time Clara felt the power of standing up for herself. It also set the course for her life. From then on, she became an activist, attending rallies, writing letters, and speaking out against the systemic racism that was rampant in her community. She became a pillar of strength in her neighborhood, known for her wisdom, kindness, and the quiet, unrelenting way she fought for justice. By the time she was in her 30s, Clara had raised a family of her own. She had 2 sons, both of whom were taught the same lessons of resilience and dignity she had learned from her mother. She worked as a teacher for over 30 years, instilling in her students the value of equality and respect, regardless of the color of one's skin. But it wasn't all easy. Over the years, Clara had faced discrimination, job loss, and more than her share of hardships. Her family had struggled financially, and she had even been forced to move several times due to neighborhood changes that were often racially motivated. But through it all, Clara never allowed herself to be diminished. When she retired, she moved into a modest apartment in the city, close to her sons and the community she had spent a lifetime serving. It wasn't a glamorous life, but it was hers. A life built on love, integrity, and the knowledge that she had done her part to make the world a little better. Tonight, sitting alone in that upscale restaurant, Clara had no idea that this evening would change everything. She hadn't expected to be treated like an outsider, especially not here, of all places. She had thought that maybe, just maybe, for once, she could enjoy a meal without the weight of the world on her shoulders. She had no way of knowing that the injustice she faced tonight would become a pivotal moment in her life, and in the lives of others. But Clara wasn't one to back down. Not when it came to her dignity. Not when it came to her rights. She had fought too long and too hard for too many others to let some arrogant restaurant owner push her around. As she was escorted out of the restaurant, she didn't make a scene. She didn't scream or shout. She simply walked with her head held high, her back straight, refusing to let them break her spirit. But inside, she felt a fire stir. The injustice of it burned deep, and Clara knew this wasn't the end. She wasn't going to let Victor or anyone else get away with what had just happened. She would fight this, and somewhere in the back of her mind, she already knew that the fight was just beginning. Victor Larson stood behind the bar, his eyes narrowed, watching Miss Clara as she made her way toward the door. He could feel his pulse quicken with frustration. His pristine restaurant, his pride and joy, had been tainted. He had built it from the ground up, carefully curating an atmosphere of exclusivity and refinement. The last thing he wanted was for it to be disrupted by someone who clearly didn't belong in his space. Victor had always been the kind of person who believed in hard work, but more than that, he believed in status. Growing up in an affluent family in Connecticut, he'd been taught that the world worked a certain way. His father, a successful businessman, had instilled in him a deep belief that only those who had worked hard enough, or had the right connections, deserved the best of what life had to offer. Victor had been groomed to lead. From the moment he was old enough to understand business, his father had made it clear that success wasn't just about doing the work. It was about setting yourself apart, curating an image of wealth and power. Victor had gone to an Ivy League school, followed by a stint working under some of the top chefs and restaurateurs in the world. When he finally opened his own restaurant, La Lumiere, he made sure it was the epitome of sophistication. He handpicked the staff, selected the finest wines, and carefully crafted the menu, making sure every dish looked as exquisite as it tasted. He didn't cater to just anyone, only the elite, those who could afford the high prices and the exclusivity. It wasn't just a restaurant. It was an experience, a statement, and anyone who didn't meet his standards didn't belong. So when he saw Miss Clara walk in that evening, sitting at a table in the far corner, his discomfort was immediate. It wasn't just her age, though that was enough of a problem for him, but the fact that she was a black woman in his high-end restaurant, alone, without the air of sophistication he expected from his clientele. He didn't even know who she was, and that, to him, meant she was out of place. In his mind, he wasn't doing anything wrong. He was simply maintaining the integrity of his establishment. No one had ever questioned his methods before. His restaurant was praised in the best food magazines, and celebrities frequented it. He had power. He had influence. People wanted to be seen at La Lumiere. And if Miss Clara didn't fit the bill, well, that was her problem. But as he watched her sit there quietly, enjoying her meal, an unsettling feeling crept up inside him. He couldn't shake the thought that she wasn't supposed to be there. That, somehow, her very presence was undermining the carefully curated image of exclusivity he had built. When he finally made the decision to approach her, he told himself it was for the good of the restaurant. He told himself that if he let her stay, the integrity of the space might be compromised. So, with a stiff jaw and a forced smile, he walked over to her table. "Excuse me, ma'am," he had said, trying to sound polite but firm. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave. You see, we have a very specific clientele here, and it's simply not the right fit for you." He had expected her to protest, but he never anticipated the grace and strength with which she responded. Her calm defiance only fueled his frustration. He had told himself that this was just business, that he was in the right. But deep down, he knew the truth. It wasn't just about the restaurant. It was about control. It was about the power he felt slipping away. As the security guard escorted Miss Clara out, Victor stood behind the bar, his hands gripping the counter. He tried to focus on the task at hand, but the voices of the few diners who had witnessed the incident began to buzz in his ears. They were whispering, exchanging glances. Some of them even looked disappointed. Victor ignored them. He didn't care about the whispers. They were nothing. He was the one who controlled the room, who dictated who was allowed in and who wasn't. He had worked too hard to let someone like Miss Clara ruin it all. But as the night wore on, something gnawed at him. The incident wouldn't leave his mind. The image of Miss Clara, standing tall, her dignified face unbroken as she walked out, stuck with him. She wasn't just some old woman. She was someone who refused to be silenced, someone who stood for something. Victor sat back in his chair, his mind racing. He didn't like it. He didn't like the idea that someone had challenged his authority and, in doing so, might have shaken his confidence. In the quiet of the restaurant, as the night wore on and the last of the patrons left, Victor felt an unease that he hadn't felt in years. Something was different now. He couldn't shake the thought that perhaps this time, he had gone too far. But by then, it was too late. As the night continued, the room of La Lumiere slowly emptied. The soft clinking of glasses and the low hum of conversations began to fade into silence. The waitstaff cleaned the tables, and Victor lingered behind the bar, his mind far from the tasks at hand. He stared into the glass of scotch in front of him, the amber liquid swirling around as if reflecting the chaos in his mind. Outside the restaurant, the city of New York carried on as usual, oblivious to the small incident that had unfolded within the elegant walls of Victor's pride and joy. But tonight, something felt off. Something had shifted in the air, and Victor couldn't quite shake the unease. The incident with Miss Clara wasn't supposed to matter. He had done what he needed to do, maintaining the restaurant's carefully curated image. She was gone. The situation was over. He had control, as he always did. But there was something else he hadn't anticipated. Someone else who had been watching. Dwayne Johnson, known the world over as The Rock, had come to La Lumiere for a quiet evening out. He was in town filming for a new movie, and after a long day of shooting, he had been craving a nice meal. When he heard about the restaurant, he decided to give it a try, eager to indulge in what many had hailed as one of the city's best dining experiences. But what he hadn't expected was the tension in the air, the unease that seemed to pulse beneath the pristine surface. Dwayne had been sitting at the back corner of the restaurant, quietly observing his surroundings as he sipped on his wine. His attention had initially been drawn to Miss Clara when she entered. The sight of an older woman, alone in a fine dining establishment, wasn't exactly uncommon, but there was something different about her. She carried herself with a quiet strength, a calm confidence that stood out even in the refined atmosphere of the restaurant. As the evening progressed, Dwayne had noticed the interactions between Miss Clara and the staff. He had seen her sit patiently, her hands neatly folded on the table, as if she were simply enjoying a peaceful meal. He had noticed the way the staff avoided her, the subtle glances exchanged between the other diners. It had seemed odd, but nothing could have prepared him for the moment when the confrontation began. Dwayne had been caught off guard when Victor approached her. The way he spoke to Miss Clara, dismissing her with a tone that dripped with disdain, made Dwayne's stomach turn. He could feel the anger rising within him, but he didn't act immediately. He wasn't sure what was going on, but he could tell that something wasn't right. He watched as Miss Clara, with a calm demeanor, stood her ground. She didn't yell, she didn't make a scene, but she didn't back down either. The strength in her silence was unmistakable. It was clear that she had been through much worse in her life, that she wasn't easily intimidated by someone like Victor. Then, when the security guard appeared, escorting her out of the restaurant, Dwayne felt the weight of the injustice settle in his chest. He had seen this kind of thing before, people being treated unfairly, dismissed, or worse, and he couldn't sit quietly any longer. Without thinking, Dwayne stood up, his tall frame towering over the table as he made his way to the front of the restaurant. The staff was still cleaning up, and the few remaining patrons were too wrapped up in their own conversations to notice him at first. He reached the door just as Miss Clara stepped outside, the cold air brushing her face. The security guard had already turned to walk back into the restaurant, not noticing Dwayne's approach. "Excuse me," Dwayne called out gently. Miss Clara turned, her eyes meeting his for the first time. There was a softness to her gaze, a warmth that made Dwayne pause for a moment. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice low and steady. Miss Clara smiled slightly, though it was tinged with sadness. "I'm fine, son. Just another day in this world." Her words were matter of fact, though the pain behind them was unmistakable. Dwayne nodded, his brow furrowing. "That shouldn't have happened. What they did to you in there. It wasn't right." Miss Clara chuckled softly, the sound rich with experience. "You're right. But sometimes, life isn't right. You learn to roll with the punches." There was something about her calm resilience that struck him deeply. It wasn't just the injustice she had faced. It was the quiet strength she exuded. It was the way she carried herself, despite all the hardships she had endured. Dwayne knew he had to do something. He couldn't just walk away from this. Not after what he had witnessed. "You don't deserve to be treated that way," he said, his voice now tinged with more determination. "I'm going to make sure something gets done about this. You don't have to go through this alone." Miss Clara's eyes softened. "I appreciate that, son, but I've been fighting these battles all my life. I don't need anyone to fight for me, but I'm grateful for the gesture." Dwayne stood there for a moment, unsure of what to say. He wasn't used to being in situations like this, but something told him that this was different. This wasn't just about one restaurant owner's bad behavior. This was about standing up for what was right, about making a stand against the kind of injustice that too often goes unnoticed. "Well, it's not over yet," he said with a quiet confidence. "Trust me, we'll see this through." Miss Clara gave him a small nod, her face softening with a quiet pride. "All right, son, but I'll be fine. Don't worry about me." And yet, as Dwayne watched her turn and walk away, something told him this was only the beginning of a much larger journey. One that would change the course of his life, as well as Miss Clara's, in ways neither of them could have anticipated. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, Dwayne felt a sense of purpose stir within him. He wasn't just watching anymore. He was ready to make a stand. The next few days after the incident weighed heavily on Dwayne's mind. It wasn't just the uncomfortable feeling he had in the pit of his stomach when he thought about Miss Clara's treatment at La Lumiere. No, it was more than that. Something about the way she had handled herself, with such grace and dignity, lingered with him. It reminded him of his own mother, who had raised him with the same quiet strength. He couldn't shake the image of her walking out of the restaurant, her head held high, despite the injustice she had just faced. He knew, deep down, that it wasn't just about one bad night at a restaurant. It was about a system that treated people like Ms. Clara as less than, simply because of the color of their skin, their age, or their place in society. And that system wasn't just going to change by ignoring it. As much as Dwayne had prided himself on being a celebrity known for his tough guy persona, there was something inside him, something that had been growing ever since that night, that told him he had to do more. The image of Miss Clara still lingered, and her calm refusal to back down had sparked something in him. He had always prided himself on standing up for what was right, but this was different. This was personal. That afternoon, Dwayne decided he was going to act. He called up his lawyer, Anna, a tough but fair woman who had worked with him on several causes over the years. He explained the situation as best as he could, leaving out none of the details, from the way Miss Clara had been treated to the unsettling feeling he couldn't shake. Anna, I don't want this to just be another thing that gets swept under the rug. It's not right. I'm not going to let it go. Not this time, he told her, his voice firm with determination. Anna listened patiently, then replied, All right, Dwayne, I hear you. We'll look into this. We can't let this kind of behavior slide. If there's a case here, we'll take it to the courts. Dwayne nodded, feeling a weight lifting from his shoulders. He knew that making this decision wasn't going to be easy, but he also knew it was the right thing to do. Miss Clara didn't deserve to be treated like that, and if he could help change the narrative, he would. Over the next few days, Anna and her team began gathering information. They reached out to potential witnesses, including the staff who had worked that night, and began collecting evidence of the restaurant's discriminatory practices. Dwayne, meanwhile, couldn't stop thinking about Miss Clara. He knew he had to find her, to talk to her about what was happening. It took a few more days, but he finally tracked her down. She was at a small community center in Harlem, volunteering her time as a mentor to young children. When Dwayne walked in, she was helping a group of kids with their homework, her warm smile lighting up the room. He had to pause for a moment, just watching her. It was clear that this woman wasn't just an innocent bystander in life. She was a force, someone who had spent years giving back to the community, standing up for others, and doing the hard work of making the world a better place. He approached her cautiously, unsure of how to start the conversation. Miss Clara, he said, his voice filled with respect. Can we talk for a minute? She looked up, her eyes narrowing for a brief moment before she recognized him. Oh, it's you, she said with a smile. You were the one from the restaurant, weren't you? Dwayne nodded. I wanted to check in on you, make sure you were all right. And I need to tell you something. I'm not letting what happened slide. I'm going to help you fight this. Miss Clara's expression softened, though there was a certain wariness in her eyes. I appreciate your kindness, but I don't need anyone to fight my battles for me. I've been fighting these battles all my life. I get that, Dwayne said, his tone gentle but firm. But this isn't just about you. This is about something bigger. I can't sit by and watch someone like you get treated like that. Not when I have the means to help change things. Clara paused for a long moment, considering his words. You don't know what you're getting into, son, she finally said. These fights, they don't end easily. You're going to face a lot of resistance. Dwayne met her gaze, his eyes full of resolve. I've faced resistance before. I'm not backing down. A long silence followed. Finally, Clara sighed, her shoulders relaxing slightly. Well, I suppose if you're going to do this, we'd better make sure we're in it for the long haul. Dwayne smiled, a weight settling in his chest. We're in this together, Miss Clara, and I promise you, we'll make sure people hear your story. For the first time since the incident, Clara allowed herself to feel a flicker of hope. It wasn't about the restaurant or the money. It was about standing up against the kind of injustice that so many had been forced to endure for far too long. And with Dwayne's help, she felt like maybe, just maybe, the world would start paying attention. The wheels of change had begun to turn, slowly but steadily. Dwayne's resolve to help Miss Clara had set things into motion, and though both of them had an inkling that this would be no easy fight, they were ready. Together, they were about to challenge a system that had allowed businesses like La Lumiere to treat people unfairly for far too long. In the following weeks, Dwayne and Anna's team worked tirelessly. They filed a formal complaint against the restaurant for discrimination, citing the manner in which Miss Clara had been treated, from being unceremoniously asked to leave based solely on her age and appearance, to the dismissive way Victor Larson had spoken to her. The media had caught wind of the story, and the press was beginning to stir. What had seemed like a small, isolated incident was now gaining traction as the narrative spread like wildfire. Victor, on the other hand, was feeling the pressure. The restaurant, once a shining star in the city's elite dining scene, was now the subject of growing criticism. The reviews online had turned from rave to scathing, and social media was awash with people sharing stories of their own mistreatment by the staff. At first, Victor had ignored it. But as the story continued to pick up momentum, his unease grew. The restaurant's pristine reputation was beginning to crack, and he knew he couldn't let it fall apart. Victor had always prided himself on controlling the narrative. He had spent years building La Lumiere into a symbol of success, not just a place to eat, but a statement. And now, here was this woman, Miss Clara, throwing that into disarray with nothing more than a quiet dignity and a refusal to be intimidated. She was making him look like a villain. He wasn't used to losing control, and that was exactly what was happening. As much as he tried to push the growing media frenzy aside, it became clear. The restaurant's reputation was at stake. He called a meeting with his PR team, trying to figure out how to contain the damage. "This is spiraling out of control," Victor said, his voice tight with frustration. "We need to put a stop to this now. How do we handle this?" His PR consultant, a sharp woman named Linda, frowned as she scrolled through her phone. "Well, for starters, we need to do damage control. We could issue a public apology, but that might not be enough at this point. You'll need to meet with Ms. Walker, make amends publicly, and show that you're taking accountability for what happened." Victor shook his head, the idea of backing down almost too much to bear. "Meet with her? Are you kidding me? After what she's done to my restaurant? I don't think so." Linda looked up, eyes narrowing slightly. "Victor, this isn't just about you and your pride. This is about saving your business. If you don't do something quickly, this could get ugly. You may have to take the hit, even if it feels like giving in." Victor clenched his jaw. "I don't give in, but I'm not a fool. We'll meet with her, but I'm doing this on my terms." Meanwhile, Clara and Dwayne were preparing for their own set of challenges. Anna had advised them to remain calm and focused, knowing that the legal battle was just beginning. The press conferences, the interviews, the legal paperwork. It was a lot for Clara, who had never dealt with the public eye in such a way before. But Dwayne had been there, in front of the cameras, in the spotlight, so he took the lead in managing the growing attention. He made sure Clara knew that they were in this together and that she wouldn't have to carry the weight alone. On the morning of the scheduled meeting between Clara and Victor Larson, the tension in the air was palpable. Clara had agreed to meet with Victor, though she wasn't sure what good it would do. She'd been through too much in her life to expect any real apology, especially from someone like him. But there was something about the situation that urged her to go through with it. Maybe it was the way Dwayne had spoken so passionately about helping her. Maybe it was the growing feeling that this wasn't just about one incident, but a symbol of something larger. When the day arrived, Dwayne drove Clara to the restaurant, a quiet determination in his eyes. They were met by Victor's PR team, who ushered them into a private dining room. Victor himself was already there, standing by the table, looking uncomfortable in his designer suit. The atmosphere was stiff, the air thick with unspoken words. Clara stepped forward, her calm presence immediately filling the room. Victor straightened up, his eyes shifting between Clara and Dwayne, as if calculating what to say next. "Well," Victor began, clearing his throat, "Ms. Walker, I want to apologize for what happened the other night. It was a misunderstanding, and I regret that things escalated the way they did." Clara didn't respond right away. She simply looked at him, her gaze unwavering. She wasn't here for a scripted apology. She wasn't here to play along with some PR stunt. She was here because what had happened to her mattered, and it was time for people to understand that. "I don't think an apology is going to fix what happened," she said quietly. "What happened wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was a reminder of how people like me, people who don't fit into your idea of what's acceptable, are treated every day." Victor stiffened, his fingers tapping on the edge of the table nervously. "I never intended to disrespect you." "Intentions don't change the reality of the situation," Clara interrupted, her voice calm but firm. "You made a choice that night, and you've made a choice every day to exclude people who don't fit into your vision of what's acceptable. It's not just me, Victor. It's the countless others who have walked through your doors and been made to feel less than." Dwayne watched as Victor's face reddened slightly, but he didn't back down. He knew the fight was far from over, and it had just begun to get personal. Victor opened his mouth to speak again, but Clara held up her hand. "You can apologize all you want, but actions speak louder than words. And I'm not interested in a Band-Aid solution. If you want to make things right, you'll need to show the world that La Lumiere can be a place for everyone, not just those who can afford to pay for a seat at your table." The tension was thick as the words hung in the air. Victor knew that Clara had just delivered the challenge of a lifetime. This wasn't going to be a quiet resolution. The fight for fairness and dignity was only just beginning. The meeting between Clara and Victor Larson had not gone as he had hoped. The once confident restaurant owner, used to being in control of every situation, now found himself on the defensive. Clara's words, calm yet cutting, lingered in the air like an unshakable truth. She wasn't asking for apologies. She was demanding accountability. She wasn't interested in playing by Victor's rules anymore. It was time for him to realize that the world was changing, and so should La Lumiere. As Dwayne drove Clara home that evening, the quiet determination in her eyes was unmistakable. She was a woman who had weathered countless storms in her life, and now she was standing tall, not just for herself, but for everyone who had been treated like an outsider in places they were meant to feel welcome. "I think he understood what I was saying," Clara murmured as the car hummed down the city streets, the glow of streetlights reflecting in her window. "But I don't know if he'll do anything about it." "I think he will," Dwayne replied, his gaze focused on the road ahead, though his mind was clearly elsewhere. "He's got too much at stake to let this slide. He'll have to make changes, or it'll be the end of La Lumiere. And I know he doesn't want that." Clara sighed, her fingers absently tracing the lines of her hands. "I hope you're right, but I've seen this before. People make promises when it's convenient, then go right back to their old ways when the pressure's off." Dwayne turned to glance at her, his voice soft but resolute. "This isn't just about saving his restaurant. It's about showing that people like you matter, that your voice counts. I'm not going to let him forget what happened." As they neared Clara's apartment, Dwayne could see the weight of the situation settling in. The fight wasn't just with Victor Larson anymore. It had become a fight against years of societal norms that had been built on exclusion and inequality. It wasn't just about one restaurant. It was about making sure everyone, regardless of race, age, or background, was treated with the respect they deserved. The following days were a whirlwind. The media frenzy surrounding La Lumiere and the incident with Clara intensified. Stories of racial discrimination and mistreatment of elderly patrons were being shared across social media, sparking conversations everywhere. Influencers, activists, and even some of Dwayne's colleagues in the entertainment industry were speaking out, demanding that the restaurant owner take responsibility. Victor, meanwhile, was scrambling. His PR team was working overtime to mitigate the damage, but the more they tried to cover things up, the more the truth seemed to seep through the cracks. He had given Clara his word that he would make amends, but the pressure was mounting, and it was becoming clear that an apology wasn't going to be enough. He needed to act. In an attempt to shift the narrative, Victor made a bold move. He agreed to a public interview with a prominent news outlet, intending to offer an apology and outline the steps La Lumiere would take to address the allegations. He wanted to look like the hero of the story, someone who had seen the error of his ways and was committed to change. But Victor wasn't prepared for the onslaught of questions that came his way during the interview. The host pressed him on the specifics of his restaurant's hiring practices, the lack of diversity among the staff, and how his policies had unintentionally created an environment that alienated certain groups of people. The more he spoke, the more his carefully crafted image began to crack. You've said that La Lumiere is about fine dining, about offering the best experience to your customers, the interviewer said, her voice sharp. But it seems like the experience you offer is only available to a very specific type of person. And many people are asking, is that really what fine dining is all about? Victor shifted uncomfortably in his seat, trying to maintain his composure. We've always prided ourselves on providing the best service, the best atmosphere. But I understand now that we may have missed the mark in some areas, and I want to make sure we correct that. The interviewer pressed further. And what about Miss Clara? Will you be personally apologizing to her? Victor hesitated. This wasn't part of the script. Yes, he said after a long pause. I'll be reaching out to Miss Clara. I hope to meet with her soon to personally apologize for what happened. Back at Clara's apartment, Dwayne watched the interview on his phone, his jaw clenched with frustration. The words Victor was saying didn't match the man Dwayne had met. He could tell that Victor wasn't sincere, that he was merely trying to salvage his reputation rather than genuinely understanding the gravity of what he had done. It didn't sit well with him. He's playing the game, Dwayne muttered under his breath, shaking his head. He's trying to make it look like he's doing the right thing without actually changing anything. Clara, who had been sitting quietly on the couch, didn't respond immediately. She knew exactly what Dwayne meant. She had seen this kind of behavior too many times before. Apologies without action, words without substance. He might apologize, she said softly, but will he change? That's what really matters. Dwayne turned to her, his expression a mix of determination and frustration. We can't let him get away with just an apology. We need to keep the pressure on him. We need to make sure he knows that change isn't just a word, it's a commitment. Clara nodded slowly. You're right, but we can't just push him into a corner. We need to show him that the world is watching, that this isn't just about one incident, but about a movement that can no longer be ignored. As Dwayne stood up, his mind racing with ideas, Clara's words hit home. This was more than just a legal fight. It was a fight for the dignity of every person who had been pushed to the margins. It wasn't just about La Lumiere. It was about all of them, the ones who had been ignored, dismissed, and forgotten. And Dwayne knew that he couldn't back down. Not now. The following weeks unfolded with a strange mix of anticipation and tension. Dwayne knew that their fight was far from over, but the small victories were beginning to add up. The public outcry against La Lumiere continued to grow, fueled by the revelations from Victor's interview and the ongoing support Clara was receiving from various advocacy groups. It was clear that this wasn't just a moment, it was a movement. Dwayne continued to use his platform to amplify Clara's voice. He posted updates about the case, shared the stories of people who had been mistreated by La Lumiere or other similar businesses, and encouraged his fans to stand with them. The support from his followers was overwhelming, and it gave Clara a sense of hope she hadn't felt in a long time. People were listening. They cared, and they were ready to see change happen. Victor Larson, however, was beginning to realize just how much damage had been done. Though he'd apologized publicly, it was clear that his words had not been enough. The restaurant's reputation continued to plummet, and the negative press was unrelenting. He had no choice but to follow through with his promises. One crisp afternoon, as Clara was sipping tea in her small but cozy living room, she received a call that would set everything in motion. It was from Victor Larson's office. Ms. Walker, a calm voice said on the other end of the line. Mr. Larson would like to personally meet with you again. He understands that the apology he offered previously didn't address the full scope of the issue, and he would like to discuss concrete steps to make things right. Clara was silent for a moment, her heart racing as she processed the words. She had expected more apologies, more attempts to save face. But this was different. This time, Victor was talking about action. She glanced over at Dwayne, who was sitting across from her, his eyes locked on hers. What do you think? She asked him, the doubt in her voice barely concealed. Dwayne leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. It could be the real deal, Clara, but we need to make sure that it's not just a show. If he's serious, we need to see the changes. Real change. Clara nodded, her resolve hardening. I'll meet with him, but this time, it won't just be about words. He's going to have to prove it. The meeting was set for the following week. Dwayne went with Clara to ensure that she wasn't alone, and to make sure the conversation remained focused on what really mattered, lasting change. When they arrived at La Lumiere, the atmosphere was markedly different. Gone was the pristine, exclusive air of the past. The staff seemed more on edge, as if they, too, were bracing for the storm that was about to unfold. Victor Larson was waiting for them in a private dining room. His demeanor had softened, but there was still an unmistakable edge to his posture, as if he was prepared for confrontation. "Ms. Walker Dwayne," he greeted them, his voice carefully measured. "I want to thank you for taking the time to meet with me again. I understand how important this conversation is, and I want to make sure we get it right." Clara didn't waste time with pleasantries. "You said you wanted to make things right, Mr. Larson. That's what we're here to discuss. But let me be clear. Apologies alone won't fix what happened. You've built an empire on exclusion, and it's time for that to change." Victor nodded slowly, clearly aware that Clara wasn't going to let him off easy. "I know," he said, his voice tinged with a hint of regret. "I've spent so many years focused on the prestige of this place that I lost sight of the bigger picture. I see now that La Lumiere has become a symbol of everything that's wrong with the industry, with the world. And I'm ready to do something about it." Clara exchanged a look with Dwayne. She had heard similar promises before, but this time, there was something in Victor's eyes that made her pause. There was a quiet sincerity there, something she hadn't seen in their first meeting. "I want to start by making a commitment to diversity," Victor continued. "We'll implement new hiring practices, focusing on bringing in staff from a variety of backgrounds and experiences. We'll also be creating a scholarship program to help young people from underrepresented communities pursue careers in the restaurant industry." Clara's gaze softened slightly, but she wasn't ready to back down. "And what about your policies? The way you've treated customers who don't fit your ideal image? How are you going to change that?" Victor's expression grew more serious. "We're going to overhaul our customer service training. Everyone will be trained on how to treat every guest with the same level of respect, no matter their race, age, or background. I understand now that the kind of behavior that happened with you, Ms. Walker, is inexcusable, and I'm going to make sure it never happens again." Clara considered his words carefully. The room was silent as she weighed her options. This was a pivotal moment, the chance to take the first step toward real change. "I'm willing to give you a chance," she said, her voice steady. "But I'm not doing this for you, Mr. Larson. I'm doing this for the people who never had the opportunity to sit at your table, the ones you ignored, dismissed, and forgot about." Victor nodded again, a sign that he understood the gravity of her words. "I understand, and I'll prove that I'm not just offering empty promises." Dwayne placed a hand on Clara's shoulder, giving her a reassuring squeeze. "This is just the beginning, but it's a start, and it's a start that matters." As they left La Lumiere, Clara felt a sense of cautious optimism stirring within her. She knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult, but for the first time in a while, she felt that maybe, just maybe, things could change. The battle was far from over, but it had taken its first step forward. The meeting with Victor Larson had given Clara and Dwayne a glimmer of hope, but the reality of the situation was far from simple. While Victor's promises were a step in the right direction, Clara knew that change wouldn't happen overnight. It wasn't just about implementing new policies. It was about shifting an entire culture, both within La Lumiere and in the broader world of fine dining. A culture that had long upheld exclusivity over inclusion. The media attention on the case didn't fade. Instead, it began to escalate. News outlets were following every development, eager to see if Victor Larson's words would match his actions. Social media continued to buzz with support for Clara, with many of her followers demanding transparency. They weren't content with just a public apology. They wanted to see proof that La Lumiere was serious about reform. Dwayne was determined to keep the pressure on. Over the next few weeks, he made several public statements, praising Clara for her courage and urging the restaurant industry as a whole to take responsibility for their biases. His calls for accountability were loud, but the backlash from some parts of the dining community was immediate. "You're really going to destroy an entire restaurant over one incident?" one critic tweeted. "This is what happens when you let celebrities dictate what's right in the industry. Where does it end?" Dwayne's response was swift and firm. It's not about destroying a restaurant. It's about making sure that the restaurant business and society at large stops treating people like Ms. Clara as less than. It's about making sure no one else has to go through what she did. While Dwayne continued to use his platform to speak out, Clara chose a different path. She wasn't interested in more media interviews or grandstanding. She preferred to keep her focus on the real work. Behind the scenes, she and Anna worked together to strategize how they could keep La Lumiere accountable. They drafted a list of tangible steps that Victor Larson could take, detailing what kind of changes would be necessary to ensure that the restaurant truly became a place where everyone felt welcome. Clara knew that it wasn't just about holding Victor accountable. It was about making sure that the changes he promised didn't slip through the cracks. That's why she, along with Dwayne's help, began to speak with industry experts and former employees who could shed light on the realities of La Lumiere's operations. They wanted to ensure that Victor was not simply paying lip service to diversity, but truly making it a cornerstone of his business. In one of their meetings, Anna looked up from her notes, her expression more serious than usual. "Clara, I'm hearing some troubling things from former staff. People who worked at La Lumiere say there was a culture of favoritism, especially toward wealthy patrons. Some employees have told me they were told explicitly not to let certain types of people in or treat them differently based on their appearance." Clara's heart sank as she processed Anna's words. She had suspected that the problem went deeper than just one incident, but hearing the details made it all the more real. "So, what do we do now?" "We need to get the word out," Anna said firmly. "We need to get a statement from these former employees, ideally on the record. And we have to be ready to go public with it if necessary. This isn't just about one woman getting kicked out. It's about the systemic problem of exclusion in the restaurant industry." Dwayne's voice, always calm and measured, broke through the tension. "We'll make sure people hear it. We can't let this story get swept under the rug. If Victor really wants to make this right, he needs to prove it. And that means the truth has to come out." Clara nodded, her determination growing. She knew that they were no longer just fighting for her. They were fighting for every person who had been treated unfairly, overlooked, or pushed aside by the powerful institutions of the world. A few days later, Clara received a call that would change everything. It was from Victor Larson. "I've received your list of demands," he began, his voice clipped, "and I've thought it over. I'm willing to make the changes you've outlined, but I need your help. If we're going to do this the right way, I need you to work with me publicly. I need you to trust me." Clara, who had been preparing herself for a more defensive call, was taken aback. "What do you mean by work with you publicly?" Victor hesitated, as if weighing his words carefully. "I'm going to announce the changes we've discussed, the diversity initiatives, the new training programs, and so on. But I need you to stand by me. I need you to show the world that this isn't just a PR stunt. You're a part of this. You're the reason this change is happening." Clara was silent for a long moment, the weight of the decision settling in. She didn't trust Victor completely, but she understood the significance of the moment. She could either continue to challenge him from the outside or step into the spotlight with him and force real change. "I'll do it," she said finally. "But make no mistake, this isn't just about you. It's about every person who's been treated like they don't belong. You need to make sure that this change is permanent and that the system you've built no longer leaves people behind." Victor agreed, though there was a palpable tension in his voice. "I understand, Ms. Walker. I won't let you down." The press conference was set for the following week. The anticipation was thick in the air, as reporters and industry insiders packed the room, eager to see what Victor Larson's next move would be. Clara stood beside him, her presence steady and strong. Victor began the conference with a brief statement of apology, but this time, his tone was different. There was no defensiveness, no attempt to justify his past actions. He simply acknowledged that La Lumiere had fallen short in its responsibilities and that it was time for a fundamental shift. "I've learned a lot in the past few weeks," Victor said, his voice steady. "And I've realized that the restaurant business is about more than just great food and ambience. It's about people. And it's about making sure that every person who walks through our doors feels valued and respected. Today, I'm announcing a series of initiatives that will change the way we do business, from our hiring practices to our customer service training. This is the beginning of a new era for La Lumiere. Clara took a step forward, her gaze focused on the crowd. I'm here today not just because of what happened to me, but because of what has happened to countless others. The changes that Mr. Larson is making are long overdue, but I believe they can make a difference. And I'm committed to ensuring that La Lumiere and the restaurant industry as a whole do better. The room erupted in applause. For the first time in what felt like forever, Clara felt that their voices, were being heard. But as the press conference ended and the cameras turned off, she couldn't shake the feeling that the true challenge had just begun. Holding Victor Larson accountable would take more than words and promises. It would take action, vigilance, and a commitment to change that extended far beyond La Lumiere. The battle was far from over, but Clara had taken her first step, and in that moment, it felt like a victory. The days following the press conference were filled with a mixture of hope and apprehension. The public's response to Victor Larson's announcement was largely positive, but Clara knew better than to believe that everything would magically change overnight. The world was watching, yes, but the real work, the difficult work, was only just beginning. Victor Larson's commitment to change had been documented in the media, and for the first time, Clara could feel a sense of anticipation in the air. People were waiting for the proof. The pressure on Victor, and by extension, La Lumiere, was palpable. Despite the widespread optimism, Clara wasn't blind to the challenges ahead. She was well aware of the forces working against genuine change. There were whispers from within the restaurant, employees who doubted the sincerity of the new initiatives. Former patrons and critics questioned whether Victor's efforts would lead to anything more than superficial reforms. They were skeptical, and for good reason. It wasn't just the outer world that Clara was concerned with. It was the undercurrent of doubt that began to stir within her as well. She had seen too many well-meaning promises fizzle out before. She had heard too many apologies that were followed by empty actions. She couldn't afford to get swept up in the excitement of the moment. She had to stay grounded, focused, and, most importantly, vigilant. A week after the press conference, Clara decided to visit La Lumiere again, not as a protester, not as an outsider, but as someone who had been given a seat at the table. She wanted to see for herself if the changes were real. Dwayne, ever supportive, insisted on accompanying her, though he too was skeptical about how much Victor had truly changed. I'm not saying we should expect perfection, Clara, Dwayne said as they approached the restaurant's grand entrance. But we both know this is a make-or-break moment. If the changes aren't visible, if the staff doesn't show a real shift, then we have to call it out. Clara nodded, adjusting the shawl around her shoulders. The weight of the decision sat heavy in her chest, but her resolve was unwavering. This wasn't just about La Lumiere anymore. This was about creating a ripple effect, a movement that could push the entire industry forward. Inside, the atmosphere felt different. The decor was still pristine, the same golden chandeliers casting their light across the polished tables, but there was a subtle shift in the air. The staff seemed to be more attentive, more engaged. Clara noted that the front-of-house team now included several new faces, a few from different ethnic backgrounds, a sign that Victor was indeed making an effort to diversify his staff. As Clara and Dwayne were seated at a table near the window, she couldn't help but observe the subtle changes. The host, a young woman of Asian descent, greeted them with a warm smile. The waitstaff, a blend of ages and backgrounds, moved through the room with a sense of purpose. Clara's eyes met Dwayne's, and though they didn't speak, a silent understanding passed between them. This was a good sign. But the true test, Clara knew, would come in the form of Victor's direct involvement. When he finally appeared, emerging from the back of the restaurant with a polite nod to the staff, Clara felt her heart rate pick up. Victor looked different. There was no arrogance in his posture, no attempt to project the same air of untouchable authority that had made him such a polarizing figure. Instead, there was a sense of openness, even vulnerability, in his eyes. "Ms. Walker," he said, approaching their table with a calm but sincere smile. "Thank you for coming. It means a lot that you're here today." Clara studied him for a moment, weighing her response. "I came to see if the changes are more than just words, Mr. Larson." Victor nodded, his expression serious. "I understand, and I'll be honest, I don't expect you to take my word for it. but I hope you'll see that we've already started putting those words into action. The meal was unlike any other Clara had experienced at La Lumiere. Every dish, every detail, seemed more thoughtful, more intentional. It was clear that Victor's kitchen was making an effort to create a dining experience that truly catered to a more diverse range of people, not just in the food, but in the atmosphere, the service, and even the clientele. The discomfort that had once permeated the air now felt like a distant memory. As the meal progressed, Victor sat down with them at their table, the conversation flowing naturally. He spoke about the new initiatives, the changes to staff training, the introduction of mentorship programs for underrepresented chefs, and the expanded menu options that celebrated a variety of culinary traditions. "We're not perfect," he admitted, looking both Clara and Dwayne in the eyes. "But we're trying, and we're learning. We have a long way to go, but I believe we're on the right track." Clara felt the weight of his words. This wasn't the same man who had kicked her out just weeks ago. She saw someone who was wrestling with the consequences of his actions and was trying to find a way forward. It wasn't enough yet, but it was a start. As the evening drew to a close, Clara felt an odd sense of peace settle over her. She wasn't convinced that Victor Larson was entirely transformed, and she wasn't ready to let her guard down. But something had shifted. A seed had been planted, and it was growing. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about everyone who had been marginalized, ignored, or mistreated in places that were supposed to make them feel welcome. They walked out of La Lumiere into the cool night air, the sound of footsteps echoing through the empty streets. Dwayne, as usual, broke the silence first. "So," he said with a raised eyebrow, "how do you feel?" Clara took a deep breath, her eyes scanning the street ahead. "I'm not sure yet," she replied thoughtfully. "But for the first time, I feel like we might be moving in the right direction. It's just going to take time." Dwayne smiled slightly. "You're right. Change doesn't happen overnight, but we've already made an impact. And if we keep pushing, if we keep showing up, it will keep moving forward." As they walked down the street, Clara allowed herself to believe that this was only the beginning. The journey ahead was uncertain, full of obstacles and challenges, but it was a journey worth taking. And this time, she wasn't walking it alone. The weeks following Clara's visit to La Lumiere were filled with a steady undercurrent of tension. Though the restaurant's outward appearance had changed, the deeper currents of resistance were harder to spot. It was easy for the media and the public to focus on the positive aspects of Victor's promises, the diversity initiatives, the new programs for underrepresented chefs, the revamped customer service training. But Clara, ever the realist, knew that change wasn't just about new programs. It was about dismantling deeply ingrained prejudices, unconscious biases, and systemic barriers that had been in place for decades. As Victor began to implement his changes, Clara stayed in the loop. She met with his new diversity officer, Samantha, who had been brought in to oversee the restaurant's transformation. Samantha was young, passionate, and determined, but she was also aware of the immense challenge ahead. "We're trying to change the culture from the inside out," she told Clara in one of their early meetings. "But old habits die hard. People who've been working here for years, they don't just shift their mindset overnight. And some of them aren't willing to change at all." Clara felt a sense of both hope and frustration. She knew that the road ahead was long, but she also understood that Victor had to navigate those who resisted the change. And in truth, it was hard to know if Victor was fully committed to seeing the process through. There were moments when his resolve seemed unwavering, but there were other times when he appeared uncomfortable with the very people he was trying to reach, those who had never been welcomed into his restaurant. One of the most difficult moments came when Clara overheard a conversation between some of La Lumiere's staff in a public space. As she sat in the corner, having a quiet coffee with Dwayne, she noticed a group of waiters and servers standing nearby, talking among themselves. "I don't know why he's bothering with all this diversity nonsense," one of the younger waiters muttered. "La Lumiere was perfect before. Now, we've got to cater to everyone? It's just going to water down the whole experience." Another server, an older man with graying hair, nodded in agreement. "Yeah, you can't just change everything and expect it to still be the same, can you? It'll never feel the same again." Clara's stomach twisted. She looked over at Dwayne, who had overheard the conversation as well. "It's happening," he said quietly, his voice low but full of concern. Some people aren't just resisting the change, they're actively sabotaging it. And that's going to be the hardest part. Over the next few weeks, Clara began to notice more signs of discontent among the staff. Certain employees were no longer showing up to training sessions, and there were whispered conversations in the kitchen when Victor wasn't around. It was clear that not everyone was on board with the vision for the future that Victor had so fervently promised. Victor, too, seemed increasingly agitated. When Clara approached him one evening, trying to bring up some of her concerns, he seemed distracted, as if his focus had been pulled in 100 different directions. "I'm doing everything I can, Clara," he said, his tone more defensive than it had been before. "I don't know how much more I can push. Not everyone is going to be happy with this." Clara watched him closely, noting the frustration in his eyes. "I understand, Victor, but it's not enough to just make changes on paper. You've got to get the people who work for you to believe in this, too. If you don't, this whole thing will fall apart." Victor sighed deeply, rubbing his forehead. "I know, but I don't know what else to do. I can't force people to change their attitudes. I can't make them want it." Clara's voice softened. "No, but you can show them why it's important. You can show them that this is about more than just the restaurant. This is about creating a space where people are treated with dignity. If you don't stand firm now, if you don't demand accountability, this will just be another chapter in a long history of nothing changing." Victor hesitated, then nodded. "I hear you. I'll find a way to make this work." Despite his words, the tension within La Lumiere continued to grow. The staff's resistance didn't fade. In fact, it seemed to strengthen. Clara began to get anonymous messages from former employees who were angry at the changes and felt like they were being forced out of the restaurant. One of the messages included a photo from an internal meeting where staff members had openly mocked the new diversity policies, suggesting they were nothing more than a corporate band-aid. But it wasn't just the staff that was resistant. The customer base, particularly the old regulars who had been coming to La Lumiere for years, were also showing signs of dissatisfaction. They made their displeasure known in subtle but powerful ways. A few left negative reviews online, claiming that the new La Lumiere was no longer the exclusive, high-end experience they had come to expect. Others, when they arrived at the restaurant, made snide comments to the waitstaff about the changes, questioning why the restaurant had ruined the atmosphere. It was clear to Clara that Victor was facing an uphill battle. The more he tried to push forward with his vision, the more opposition he encountered. And while Clara understood the magnitude of the challenge, she couldn't ignore the truth that was becoming increasingly apparent. The resistance wasn't just coming from the outside. It was coming from within. Victor Larson, the man who had once seemed so steadfast in his mission to change, was now in the thick of a battle not just for his restaurant's reputation, but for the very future of La Lumiere itself. One night, after an especially difficult dinner service, Victor called Clara. His voice was strained, tinged with a frustration that was hard to ignore. "Clara, I'm at a crossroads. I don't know how much longer I can do this. The backlash from my staff is getting worse. People are questioning whether this vision is even possible." Clara listened, her heart heavy with sympathy. She could hear the exhaustion in his voice. "I can't give up on this," Victor continued. "I want to do the right thing. I want to make sure people like you never feel excluded in my restaurant again. But I'm starting to wonder if it's even possible." Clara didn't hesitate. "Victor, you have to keep going. This is bigger than just La Lumiere. This is about changing the entire industry. But you need to be ready for the fight. This is going to take everything you've got, and more." Victor was silent for a moment. Then, with a shaky breath, he spoke again. "I don't know if I'm strong enough for this." Despite his words, the tension within La Lumiere continued to grow. The staff's resistance didn't fade. In fact, it seemed to strengthen. Clara began to get anonymous messages from former employees who were angry at the changes and felt like they were being forced out of the restaurant. One of the messages included a photo from an internal meeting where staff members had openly mocked the new diversity policies, suggesting they were nothing more than a corporate band-aid. But it wasn't just the staff that was resistant. The customer base, particularly the old regulars who had been coming to La Lumiere for years, were also showing signs of dissatisfaction. They made their displeasure known in subtle but powerful ways. A few left negative reviews online, claiming that the new La Lumiere was no longer the exclusive, high-end experience they had come to expect. Others, when they arrived at the restaurant, made snide comments to the waitstaff about the changes, questioning why the restaurant had ruined the atmosphere. It was clear to Clara that Victor was facing an uphill battle. The more he tried to push forward with his vision, the more opposition he encountered. And while Clara understood the magnitude of the challenge, she couldn't ignore the truth that was becoming increasingly apparent. The resistance wasn't just coming from the outside. It was coming from within. Victor Larson, the man who had once seemed so steadfast in his mission to change, was now in the thick of a battle not just for his restaurant's reputation, but for the very future of La Lumiere itself. One night, after an especially difficult dinner service, Victor called Clara. His voice was strained, tinged with a frustration that was hard to ignore. "Clara, I'm at a crossroads. I don't know how much longer I can do this. The backlash from my staff is getting worse. People are questioning whether this vision is even possible." Clara listened, her heart heavy with sympathy. She could hear the exhaustion in his voice. "I can't give up on this," Victor continued. "I want to do the right thing. I want to make sure people like you never feel excluded in my restaurant again. But I'm starting to wonder if it's even possible." Clara didn't hesitate. "Victor, you have to keep going. This is bigger than just La Lumiere. This is about changing the entire industry. But you need to be ready for the fight. This is going to take everything you've got, and more." Victor was silent for a moment. Then, with a shaky breath, he spoke again. "I don't know if I'm strong enough for this." Clara hung up the phone, her resolve firming. The road ahead was long, and it would be filled with even more challenges than they had faced so far. But she wasn't backing down. She had already fought for so much, and now, more than ever, she was willing to fight for what was right. If Victor Larson was willing to take the hard steps toward real change, then Clara was ready to stand beside him. But if he faltered, if he let the resistance win, she would make sure the world knew the truth. The journey was far from over, and Clara had no intention of stopping now. The air felt thick with anticipation, as if the very walls of La Lumiere were holding their breath. Victor's commitment to change had been tested in every possible way, from staff resistance to customer backlash, but it was clear that the tipping point was nearing. Clara could feel the tension, like an invisible thread stretching tighter with every passing day. The question now was whether it would snap. It was a Friday evening when everything seemed to come to a head. Victor had called Clara earlier that day, his voice strained. "We're facing a full-on revolt in the kitchen, Clara," he had said. "I can't pretend everything's fine anymore. We're barely keeping the doors open tonight. I need you here." Clara could hear the raw emotion in his voice. She had seen the cracks before, but never like this. She knew it was time to step in, but as she walked through the restaurant's grand entrance later that evening, a sense of unease settled in her chest. There was something in the air tonight, something volatile, ready to explode. Dwayne, always by her side, walked with her toward the back of the restaurant, where Victor was waiting. The staff seemed unusually tense, moving quickly but with the kind of urgency that comes with fear rather than professionalism. They exchanged nervous glances as Clara passed, and the silence in the room grew louder with each step. When they finally reached the kitchen, Victor stood at the door, his expression weary. He didn't even need to say anything. The chaos around them told the story. A group of cooks, some of the most experienced staff members, were arguing loudly with one another, their frustration palpable. "Victor!" one of the head chefs shouted, throwing his hands up in exasperation. "You can't just bring in all these new people and expect things to stay the same. This is going to ruin us. We've been running this kitchen for years. We know what works." Victor took a deep breath, his jaw tight. "I'm not asking for perfection. I'm asking for change. You have to trust me." But the head chef wasn't listening. "Trust you? You're throwing everything we've built out the window for some corporate diversity agenda. It's not working, and it's never going to work." The argument intensified, voices rising, emotions running high. Clara's heart raced as she saw Victor's composure crack. It was clear that the restaurant's culture wasn't just resistant to change. It was fighting back with everything it had. She knew this moment would come, but that didn't make it any easier to witness. Dwayne, sensing the growing tension, stepped forward. "This isn't helping," he said, his voice calm but firm. "You're all so focused on fighting each other that you're forgetting why you're here in the first place. This restaurant is more than just a place to work. It's a chance to do something different, something better." One of the cooks, a woman with short cropped hair and a stern look on her face, scoffed. "Doing something better? You really think that's what this is about? You think this is about making the restaurant better? It's about keeping your job, that's all it is." Clara felt the sting of the words. The cook wasn't wrong. The fear of change was palpable, especially for those whose livelihoods depended on maintaining the status quo. But Clara knew that if they didn't break through this resistance now, everything Victor had worked for would fall apart. "Enough!" Victor finally shouted, his voice cutting through the noise. The room fell silent, the tension thick. "I don't care if you agree with me. I don't care if you like the changes I'm making. What I care about is whether you want to be part of this restaurant's future. If you can't get on board with that, then I'll find people who will." Clara's heart sank. She could hear the desperation in Victor's voice. He wasn't just trying to keep the peace. He was fighting to save everything he had worked for. And right now, it felt like everything was slipping through his fingers. One by one, the cooks exchanged uncertain glances. It was clear that the battle lines had been drawn. The change was either going to happen, or it wasn't. And if it didn't, there was a good chance that La Lumière, as they knew it, would cease to exist. Victor turned to Clara, his face drained of all emotion. "I've tried everything," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've pushed every boundary I can, but I'm not sure how much more I can take. Maybe I've bitten off more than I can chew." Clara could see the vulnerability in his eyes, the same vulnerability she had seen in him when he first called her to help him make things right. This wasn't just about the restaurant anymore. It was about his identity, his sense of self-worth. Victor had spent so much of his life building a reputation based on a certain standard of excellence, and now he was being forced to tear that down in the name of progress. Dwayne stepped up, his tone strong but reassuring. "You've come too far to quit now. Don't let fear win. You can change this, but you can't do it alone. You need to lead by example. It's not just about making demands. It's about showing people that you believe in this vision. You can do this, Victor, but you have to believe that it's worth fighting for." Clara added, her voice steady. "We believe in you, Victor, but you have to take the next step. You can't keep standing in the middle of this mess and hoping it'll work itself out. It's time to make a choice." Victor's eyes darted between Clara and Dwayne. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, with a deep breath, Victor nodded slowly. "You're right," he said quietly. "I can't keep waiting for things to change on their own. I have to take control. I can do this." And just like that, the shift began. It wasn't immediate. It wasn't a clean break. But the power of that decision, Victor's willingness to take the hard steps and face the consequences of his actions, was the turning point they needed. Victor addressed his staff, his voice steady, now free of the doubt that had once clouded it. "This isn't easy. It's not going to be easy. But we have to change, or we'll become irrelevant. If you can't get behind that, I understand. But if you're willing to take this journey with me, then we need to be a team. We're in this together. All of us." There was still a long road ahead, and many more battles to be fought. But in that moment, Clara saw something she hadn't seen before. True leadership, born from the strength of conviction. As the night wore on, the restaurant calmed. There were no immediate solutions, no instant victories. But there was a sense of resolve in the air, and it was enough to spark a glimmer of hope. The future of La Lumière, and the future of the change it symbolized, was still in play. Victor had made his choice. Now, it was time for the restaurant and everyone in it to follow suit. The next few days felt like a turning point in slow motion. Every hour that passed felt weighted with uncertainty, and yet there was something undeniable in the air. A sense that the tension was about to break, one way or another. Victor's decision to confront his team and demand their commitment to change had left a visible mark. There were whispers in the hallways of La Lumière, and staff members were beginning to talk openly about what had happened during that fateful meeting. Some were visibly shaken, some resigned, while others, particularly the newer hires, seemed more determined than ever to rally behind Victor's vision. But the old guard, the chefs, the wait staff, the lifeblood of the restaurant for years, remained divided. Clara spent her days trying to keep the momentum moving forward. She met with Samantha, Victor's diversity officer, to discuss the next steps. The restaurant's newly introduced programs were being put to the test: mentorship initiatives, cultural competency workshops, and inclusive leadership training. Clara knew that these efforts were important, but there was still a deep undercurrent of resistance to overcome. But there was no denying the strain. Clara could see it in Victor's face every time they crossed paths. He was starting to unravel. The weight of the battle was taking a toll on him in ways he hadn't expected. The promise of change had cost him more than he had anticipated. Not just the resistance of his staff, but the emotional cost of standing alone in a fight he hadn't fully understood. One afternoon, Clara found Victor sitting at a small table in the back room, his head buried in his hands. She walked over slowly, unsure of how to approach him. There was no bravado left in him now, only exhaustion. "I don't know what to do anymore, Clara," he said quietly without lifting his head. "Every step I take seems to be one step further away from what this place used to be, what it should be. I thought I could fix it. I thought I could make it right. But it feels like I'm just digging us deeper." Clara sat down beside him, her heart heavy. She had never seen Victor so vulnerable, so defeated. He had always been the one to push forward, to make things happen, but now it seemed like everything was unraveling. "You've made a difference, Victor," she said softly. "You've changed the conversation, at least. The people who have resisted may not understand it now, but they will. But if you back down now, if you let fear control this moment, then we've lost." Victor's eyes flicked up, raw emotions swimming in them. "What if I'm not strong enough to keep going? What if I can't change this, change myself, the way I thought I could?" Clara's heart ached for him. She understood the struggle. Victor had built this restaurant with his own hands, carving out a space for luxury and exclusivity. But now, he was fighting to dismantle the very structure he had put in place. And that was not an easy battle to fight. "You don't have to do it alone," Clara said firmly. "You've got people who believe in this, people who want to see it through. You're not just fighting for La Lumiere anymore. You're fighting for something much bigger than any of us. This is about what kind of world we want to live in." Victor looked at her, searching her face for something. Then, he nodded slowly. "You're right. I can't give up now. Not after all this. It's just, this fight, it's exhausting. I thought it would be different. I thought it would be easier." Clara's voice softened. "You knew it wouldn't be easy, Victor. But nothing worth fighting forever is." Later that evening, the restaurant was packed. The dining room was alive with chatter, the clink of glasses, and the hum of conversation. But Clara could sense the underlying tension that still filled the space. The staff still felt the weight of the changes, still unsure of what their role in the future would be. As the night wore on, Clara sat at a table in the back corner, observing. She saw the way the old waitstaff gave the new employees side glances, the way the cooks hesitated before entering the kitchen. But she also saw something else, something subtle but undeniable. A quiet shift. A few of the younger waiters, ones who had embraced the changes wholeheartedly, were making an effort to talk to their more seasoned colleagues. One of them, a young woman named Mia, was laughing with one of the more grizzled line cooks, a man named Carlos, who had been one of the most vocal critics of Victor's new vision. Clara could see that while Carlos wasn't fully on board, the icy distance between him and the younger staff had begun to thaw, just a little. It was in that moment, watching the small gestures of connection, that Clara realized something important. Change, real change, wasn't about making the resistance disappear overnight. It wasn't about winning a battle, but about showing up every day and taking one small step at a time. It was about shifting the atmosphere, creating opportunities for people to come together, even if just for a moment. But the real test was yet to come. Later that night, as Clara was about to leave, Victor came over to her, his expression more resolved than it had been in days. "I've made my decision," he said, his voice steady. Clara raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "I'm going to double down," Victor said, a fire lighting in his eyes. "I'm going to make this change real. I've been afraid of pushing too hard, of making things worse. But you're right. If I back down now, everything we've worked for is gone. Clara smiled, the weight she had been carrying for so long lifting slightly from her shoulders. So, what now? Now, Victor said, his voice growing stronger, we take the next step. We make it impossible for anyone to ignore this. We make La Lumiere a place where every person, every story, every culture feels welcome. No more pretending. No more half measures. Clara's heart swelled with pride. She knew this wouldn't be easy. There were still going to be obstacles, still going to be resistance. But for the first time in a long while, she felt hopeful. As Victor turned to walk away, Clara stopped him for a moment. You're not alone in this, she said. You've got all of us with you. Victor paused, meeting her gaze. I won't forget that. Outside, the cold wind swept through the streets of the city, a reminder that the world was still turning, still moving forward. And La Lumiere, for all its flaws and all its battles, was moving forward too. Maybe, just maybe, this would be the beginning of something new. A new chapter for the restaurant, for Victor, and for Clara, and for every person who had ever walked through those doors, hoping to find something more than just a meal. It was a week after Victor's decision to push forward, and the change he had promised was beginning to manifest in subtle yet significant ways. La Lumiere, once filled with whispers of discontent, now hummed with an energy that had been absent for far too long. But even as the restaurant began to breathe a little easier, Clara knew that the hardest part was still ahead. The process of transformation, of creating something truly inclusive, wasn't just about new policies or grand gestures. It was about the quiet, everyday moments of connection, where people chose to meet each other halfway. That afternoon, Victor gathered the entire team together for a meeting. The restaurant was quieter than usual, the early lunch crowd already finished and heading out, leaving the space open for the conversation they all knew was coming. Clara took her place at the front, next to Victor, as he stood before his staff, the weight of the moment still pressing down on him. Thank you for being here, he began, his voice more confident than it had been in weeks. I know things haven't been easy, and I know some of you are still skeptical about the changes I've been pushing for. But I want to tell you, honestly, this is not just about me or La Lumiere. This is about creating something that lasts, something better than what we've had before. And we can't do that without each and every one of you. There was a shift in the room as his words settled in. Victor wasn't just speaking as a boss anymore. He was speaking as someone who understood the stakes, as someone who had the courage to admit his vulnerabilities and move past them. There was something raw about his sincerity, something that felt like it was coming from the core of his being. Clara could see that the staff was starting to listen, truly listen. There were still some skeptical looks, but the tension that had hung in the air for so long seemed to be loosening. The room felt lighter, even if just for a moment. I've learned a lot these past few weeks, Victor continued, his gaze sweeping over the faces of his team. I've learned that change isn't just about what you say. It's about what you do. And it's about who you become in the process. I'm not asking for perfection. I'm asking for trust. Trust that we're headed in the right direction, even when it doesn't feel easy. There was a long pause, and then something unexpected happened. One of the cooks, the same one who had been the most vocal in his opposition just a week ago, stepped forward. I'll admit, Carlos said, his voice gruff but steady, I didn't think this would work. Hell, I didn't even want it to. But I've seen the changes. I've felt them, and I'm willing to give this a shot. If we're really going to make this place something more, I'm in. Victor smiled, a genuine, relieved smile. Thank you, Carlos. That means more than you know. It was a small gesture, but in that moment, Clara felt a spark of hope. It wasn't a magical fix, and the road ahead was still uncertain, but it was a step forward, and sometimes that was all they needed. The meeting continued, with Victor outlining the steps they would take to move forward. There were new team-building exercises scheduled, as well as follow-up workshops to ensure that the inclusivity training wasn't just a one-off, but a constant part of the restaurant's ethos. The staff was to be held accountable not just for their technical skills, but for how they treated each other and the guests who walked through their doors. As the meeting came to an end, Clara caught Victor's eye across the room. She could see the exhaustion in his face, But there was something else there too, a sense of purpose that had been absent before. "You did it," Clara said as she approached him, her voice quiet but filled with pride. Victor gave a half smile, his usual confidence returning. "We did it. It's not over. But I think we might be on the right track." Later that evening, the restaurant was busier than usual, with a larger-than-expected dinner rush. As Clara moved through the dining room, overseeing the service, she could feel a difference in the energy. The staff, while still a little nervous, were working together in ways that hadn't been possible before. They were communicating more, supporting one another in ways that hadn't seemed likely just a few days ago. At one point, Clara stopped by a table where an older woman and her granddaughter were seated. They'd been regulars at La Lumiere for years, and Clara had come to recognize their faces. But tonight, something was different. The older woman, a familiar, distinguished-looking patron, was smiling wider than usual, laughing softly with her granddaughter as their server brought them their dishes. "Everything okay?" Clara asked, smiling as she approached their table. The older woman looked up at her, her eyes bright with something like pride. "You know, dear," she said, "I've been coming here for years, but tonight, it feels different. There's something in the air, a good energy, a welcoming energy. I don't know what you've done, but it's working. I can feel it." Clara's heart swelled at the compliment. This was why they had fought so hard. This was the change they had worked for, a shift in the very culture of the restaurant. It wasn't just about serving food. It was about serving people, all people, with respect and dignity. "Thank you," Clara said softly. "That means a lot to us." As she walked away, she found herself reflecting on the journey. The struggle had been intense, filled with personal and professional challenges. But there was a quiet satisfaction in the air now, a sense that they had weathered the storm and emerged stronger for it. In the end, the hardest battles had always been about more than just the restaurant. They were about the people who made it what it was, the ones who fought for change, the ones who had the courage to look at the world and say, "It can be better, and I'll be part of making it that way." Clara knew that they weren't done yet. There was still work to do. But for the first time, it didn't feel impossible. As the night drew to a close and the staff began cleaning up, Clara caught a glimpse of Victor in the back room. He was sitting alone, his head resting against the back of a chair, his eyes closed. There was a calmness about him now, a kind of peace that hadn't been there before. She walked over and stood beside him for a moment, just watching him. After all they had been through, all the doubts and struggles, they had come this far. And maybe, just maybe, the journey had been worth it. "Thanks for believing in this," she said softly, breaking the silence. Victor looked up at her, his tired eyes meeting hers. "I couldn't have done it without you, Clara. This feels like something real, like we're creating something that lasts." Clara smiled, her heart full. "Yeah, we are." And for the first time, as the restaurant settled into the quiet of the night, Clara felt a sense of certainty wash over her. This was only the beginning of a new chapter for La Lumiere and for all of them. The weeks that followed were marked by a slow but undeniable transformation within La Lumiere. The initial uncertainty had shifted into a renewed sense of purpose, and although the work wasn't easy, there was a visible shift in how the restaurant operated, how the staff interacted with each other, and how they welcomed guests. It wasn't a perfect change, but it was real. Clara watched with pride as Victor's vision continued to take root. He had started holding open forums with the staff, where they could voice concerns, suggest ideas, or even challenge the direction they were headed. These meetings were uncomfortable at first, but they became a space for honest conversations and, more importantly, a space for mutual respect to blossom. One of the most profound changes was how the staff had begun to take ownership of their roles in the transformation. It wasn't just about being told what to do anymore. They were being asked to think critically about the restaurant's culture, about how they could each contribute to making it a more inclusive, welcoming place. And it was working. One afternoon, as Clara walked through the restaurant, she noticed something that spoke volumes about how far they had come. The kitchen, typically filled with chaos and tension, was now filled with a lightness she hadn't seen before. There was laughter among the chefs, and more importantly, there was cooperation. Mia, One of the younger servers, who had been a passionate advocate for the changes, was chatting with Carlos, one of the older line cooks, over the stove. Clara stopped for a moment to watch the interaction. Carlos, who had once been one of the most resistant voices in the kitchen, was now teaching Mia a trick to speed up her plating. His rough exterior hadn't changed, but his attitude had. He wasn't just tolerating the changes, he was embracing them. "Hey, Clara," Mia said, noticing her standing by the doorway. "Carlos just taught me a way to get everything out in under 10 minutes. It's like magic." Carlos smirked. "It's all about speed and precision, kid." Clara smiled, feeling a sense of relief wash over her. She knew that this was no small feat. It was moments like this that proved to her that the work they had put in was starting to pay off. As she continued her walk through the restaurant, Clara noticed that the patrons seemed more at ease as well. The energy in the dining room was different, more vibrant. Guests were engaging with the staff in ways they hadn't before, and there was an ease to the atmosphere that hadn't been present during the initial transition. They were no longer walking on eggshells, worried about who might be watching or who might be offended by a new policy. They were just people working together. One evening, as Clara was overseeing the floor, a couple came in for dinner. They were regulars, older, refined, and always courteous. But tonight, Clara could sense that something was different. They weren't just enjoying their meal, they were engaged. They spoke with their server, a young woman named Lily, about the changes that had taken place. "You know," the woman said, looking around the dining room, "I've been coming here for years, but there's something different now. Something warmer. The energy is much more inviting. I don't know what you've done, but it feels like La Lumiere has finally found its soul." Clara's heart swelled. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft. "That means everything to us." The woman smiled, her eyes twinkling. "You've done something special here. You've made it feel like home again." Later that night, after the last guest had left and the restaurant was quiet, Victor sat in his office, flipping through a stack of papers. It had been a long day, one of many in the past few months, but tonight there was a sense of calm in the air. The storm of resistance, the internal battles and doubts, had finally settled into something resembling peace. Clara walked in, leaning against the doorframe. "I've been meaning to tell you. You did it, Victor. You really did." Victor looked up from his papers and gave her a tired but contented smile. "We did it, Clara. I couldn't have done this without you." Clara sat down across from him, her expression thoughtful. "It wasn't easy, but it was worth it. The hardest part is always the beginning. And now, it feels like we're in a rhythm." Victor leaned back in his chair, taking a deep breath. "Yeah, it feels like we're finally starting to understand what we're about. It's not just about great food and service anymore. It's about people. It's about community. It's about making this space something that belongs to everyone." Clara nodded. "Exactly. And you know what? I think this restaurant, this place, is going to be around for a lot longer than any of us thought." Victor's eyes glimmered with hope, something he hadn't felt in a while. "I think you're right." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, both of them reflecting on the journey they had been on. The road had been long and fraught with obstacles, but now, looking around at the changes that had taken place, they both knew that they were on the other side of something monumental. In the weeks that followed, the changes at La Lumiere became more than just a story within the walls of the restaurant. Word began to spread, not just about the food or the service, but about the experience. The inclusivity, the welcoming atmosphere, the sense of belonging that now defined La Lumiere became a talking point among regulars and new visitors alike. It wasn't just about making the staff feel valued. It was about making every guest, regardless of who they were, feel seen and appreciated. The new policies, the training, the open conversations, all of it came together to create something that felt more genuine, more authentic. Victor's restaurant had always been a symbol of success, of luxury, but now it was becoming a symbol of something even more important, of growth, of change, of the power of a community willing to evolve. One late evening, as Clara walked through the now empty restaurant, she looked out at the dining area. It was quiet, but there was a new sense of peace in the space. She thought about all the people who had helped make this possible, the staff, the guests, the community, and she realized that what had started as a single, quiet act of defiance against complacency had turned into something far more lasting. The future was no longer uncertain. It was bright, and as the city lights twinkled outside, Clara knew that this was only the beginning. The days that followed the restaurant's transformation were filled with a quiet excitement. It wasn't an overnight change. It wasn't supposed to be. It was the slow, steady work of building something lasting. Yet the positive energy at La Lumiere was palpable, lingering like the scent of a freshly prepared dish, comforting and satisfying. For Victor, it was both a sense of relief and a challenge. He had gotten what he'd hoped for: a staff that was more united, guests who felt a deeper connection to the space, and a reputation that was shifting towards something even more special than before. But he knew that this wasn't the end. In fact, in some ways, this was just the beginning. It was a Tuesday afternoon when Clara first noticed it, the subtle shift in the air. There was an unease that hadn't been there before, a tension building under the surface. The staff, while still united, were now facing a new kind of pressure. The restaurant's growing reputation had led to more attention, both positive and negative. That evening, after a particularly long shift, Clara took a moment to talk with Mia, who had been with La Lumiere since the initial changes had begun. "Something's off," Clara said, sitting across from her at a small table in the back of the restaurant. "Have you noticed it? The vibe has shifted. It's like we're caught in the calm before another storm." Mia looked around, her eyes scanning the room before she spoke. "I think it's because people are starting to take notice. We've got a lot more people coming in to see if the changes are real. They expect perfection now." Clara sighed, running her fingers through her hair. "Yeah, and that pressure can break anyone. We've worked hard to get here, but we need to make sure the change sticks, even when it's not easy." Mia nodded thoughtfully. "I don't think anyone's going to give up now, but it's definitely a new kind of challenge. It's like we've got a target on our back. Some people want to see us fail." Victor, too, had begun to sense the growing unease. While La Lumiere was doing better than ever in terms of business, the pressure to maintain the new standards was beginning to wear on everyone. The staff had come a long way, but they were now being asked to not only deliver exceptional service but to continue evolving in ways that were becoming increasingly difficult to keep up with. Late one night, as Victor sat in his office poring over paperwork, he heard a knock at the door. It was Lily, one of the younger servers, her face drawn with concern. "Come in," he said, gesturing toward the chair across from him. Lily sat down, her eyes tired. "Victor, I think we need to talk. There's a lot of pressure, and it's starting to show. We've come so far, but now it feels like we're constantly trying to prove ourselves to everyone." Victor leaned back in his chair, rubbing the back of his neck. "I know. I've been feeling it too. We've made huge strides, but with all this attention, it's like we've put ourselves in the spotlight. And the truth is, some people don't like what we're doing. We're shaking things up, and not everyone appreciates that." Lily nodded. "Exactly. We have to keep the quality up, but we also need to maintain what we've built. The culture, the inclusivity. But it's exhausting." There was a brief silence as Victor processed her words. Then he leaned forward, his expression serious. "You're right. We need to find a way to manage the pressure, not just for the business, but for ourselves. We've made this change because it matters, not because we wanted to be perfect. We can't lose sight of that." The next few days were a flurry of activity as Victor and Clara worked closely with the team to address the growing tension. They decided to hold another staff meeting, not just about policy changes or the next steps, but to give everyone a chance to voice their concerns and frustrations. It was time to recalibrate, to realign their focus and ensure they weren't veering off course. As the staff gathered in the dining room for the meeting, Clara looked around at the faces of the people who had been through so much together. There was a certain fatigue in the air, but also a shared determination. They had come too far to give up now. Victor stood at the front, his gaze scanning the room. "I know we've been through a lot in a short amount of time," he began, his voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of concern. "And I know the pressure is building. It's easy to forget why we're doing this in the first place. But I want to remind you all, what we're doing here isn't just about the food or the service. It's about creating something real, something that lasts. And I'm not asking for perfection. I'm asking for honesty. We need to be honest with each other, and we need to support one another. There was a quiet murmur of agreement from the staff. Victor continued. So, I want to hear from you. What's working? What's not working? How can we help each other get through this next phase? The meeting turned into a candid conversation, with each team member voicing their frustrations, their concerns, and their ideas for improvement. Some felt overwhelmed by the increasing demands, while others felt the weight of constantly trying to meet high expectations. Yet, through it all, there was a shared understanding. They were in this together. Lily spoke up again. We've made it this far because we've had each other's backs. But now it's like we're constantly trying to live up to something that's been built up so high. It's scary. Carlos, who had been one of the most vocal in his doubts during the early days of change, now spoke with a wisdom born of experience. We can't be afraid to fail. We've been through too much together to let fear stop us. We need to trust ourselves and each other to keep pushing forward, no matter how tough it gets. There was a quiet nod of agreement around the room. And for the first time in days, Clara felt a spark of hope reignite. Maybe this wasn't the calm before the storm. Maybe it was just the storm itself, and they would weather it together. By the end of the meeting, the team had agreed to a few key changes. They would continue pushing for excellence, but they would also allow themselves grace, acknowledging that perfection was an ongoing journey, not a destination. The focus would shift from proving themselves to others to proving something to themselves. That they could do this without compromising the culture they had worked so hard to build. As the team dispersed, Clara and Victor stayed behind for a moment, standing side by side in the middle of the restaurant. We're not done yet, Victor said, his voice firm with resolve. There's still a long way to go, but I believe in this team. I believe in what we've built. Clara smiled, her heart full. We'll keep fighting for it. We've come too far to turn back now. And as the restaurant settled into a new rhythm, Clara felt a quiet confidence that the hardest challenges were behind them. But even in that certainty, she knew there would always be new challenges on the horizon, and they would face them together, stronger than before. The weeks that followed the team's candid meeting brought with them a renewed sense of focus, but also a quiet exhaustion. The atmosphere at La Lumiere had shifted. The pressure to maintain the restaurant's newfound reputation weighed heavily on everyone. For the first time since the changes had begun, Clara and Victor found themselves questioning whether they could truly sustain the momentum. It wasn't that they had lost their passion or commitment. Rather, they had become acutely aware of just how fragile the balance was. They had worked hard to create an inclusive, welcoming environment, but now they faced the constant challenge of ensuring that their vision remained true to what they had set out to do. And the reality of being in the spotlight, of being known not just for their food but for their values, came with a unique set of obstacles. Clara was finishing up a particularly grueling shift one Friday night when she stepped outside to catch a breath of fresh air. The restaurant had been packed, and the pressure had been palpable in the air all evening. She pulled out her phone to check the time and noticed a message from Mia, one of the servers who had been with La Lumiere since the early days of the transformation. Hey, Clara, do you have a second? I need to talk. Clara frowned, slipping the phone back into her pocket and heading toward the alley that led to the staff entrance. Mia was sitting on a bench, her head in her hands. When she saw Clara approach, her face was tight with frustration. Hey, Mia, Clara greeted gently, sitting down beside her. What's going on? Mia exhaled sharply. I'm just overwhelmed. Everyone's so focused on keeping up with the expectations. The perfect reviews, the constant pressure to be better than we were last week, and it's exhausting. We're all running on fumes, and it feels like if we slip up just once, it'll all come crashing down. Clara could feel the weight of Mia's words. She had heard similar concerns from others on the team, but hearing it directly from Mia, who had been one of the most enthusiastic proponents of the change, struck a chord with her. I know, Clara said quietly. I've been feeling it too. The constant pressure to keep up with the pace, to be perfect, it's hard, and sometimes it feels like we're walking a tightrope. Mia nodded, her voice softer now. We're so focused on maintaining the new La Lumiere that I'm not sure we're even taking care of ourselves anymore. Clara sighed. It's easy to forget, isn't it? In the middle of all this growth and success, we lose sight of what made this restaurant a success in the first place. The people, the heart of it all. Mia looked at her, her eyes tired but resolute. I just don't want us to burn out. I don't want all of this to crumble because we've lost what we were really working for. Clara smiled faintly, resting a hand on Mia's shoulder. You're right. We need to remember why we started this. For each other. To make a difference. To create something lasting. They sat in silence for a moment, the hum of the city around them, before Clara stood up and extended her hand to Mia. Let's take a step back tomorrow. Let's remind ourselves of what's important. We've come a long way, but we don't need to lose ourselves in the process. Mia gave a small, grateful smile and accepted Clara's hand. Thanks, Clara. I needed that. The next day, Clara took a bold step. She closed the restaurant for an afternoon. She had spoken to Victor about it, and although he was initially hesitant, he eventually agreed. They had built La Lumiere into something incredible, but now it was time to remember what had truly made it special. The people who worked there and the community they had created. For the first time in weeks, the restaurant was empty in the middle of the day. Clara had gathered the entire team together for a casual lunch in the back room, complete with music, laughter, and an open, honest conversation. No formalities, no orders to be taken, no guests to impress. Just the team, sharing a meal together and reconnecting. Victor stood up halfway through the meal, his voice breaking through the chatter. I know this place means a lot to each of you. I know how hard you've worked to get here. But I also know that if we're going to keep going, if we're going to continue to grow and be the restaurant we want to be, we need to take care of ourselves first. Clara added, we can't be afraid to step back, to take a breath. We've already proven we can do this, but we need to do it together. Not just as a team, but as a family. The room fell silent for a moment as the team absorbed their words. And then, slowly, people began to smile. There was a sense of relief in the air, as though a weight had been lifted, if only for a little while. Mia spoke up, her voice steady but full of warmth. It's good to remember why we're doing this. We're not here just for the food. We're here for each other. And that's what's going to keep us going. As the afternoon wore on, the team felt a renewed sense of connection. The pressure, while still present, no longer felt as insurmountable. They had learned to balance ambition with self-care, to ensure that the culture they had created was not just about outward success, but about sustaining the internal values that had made La Lumiere a beacon of change. Clara looked around at her team, her family, and felt a deep sense of pride. They had weathered the storm, and they were stronger for it. But more than that, they had learned that true success wasn't measured by accolades or reviews. It was measured by the integrity of their work, the unity of the team, and the authenticity of their mission. That evening, as the restaurant opened for dinner service, the staff moved with a sense of ease. The energy was different, lighter, yet purposeful. The guests who walked through the door felt it too, commenting on the warmth in the air, the genuine hospitality they were receiving. It wasn't just about what was on the plate anymore. It was about the experience, the care, the heart behind everything they did. As the night drew to a close, Victor and Clara stood by the kitchen door, watching the team as they worked. There was no longer the same frantic energy they had once seen. Instead, there was a rhythm, a flow, a shared understanding that they were in this together, come what may. Clara turned to Victor with a small smile. We've come a long way, haven't we? Victor grinned, his eyes warm. We sure have, and we'll keep going. Together. The calm after the storm didn't last long. As La Lumiere continued to grow, the stakes grew higher. Clara and Victor had managed to reestablish a healthy balance within the team, but now they were faced with an entirely new kind of challenge, one that was harder to pinpoint and even harder to control. The restaurant's success had drawn attention, not just from loyal customers and critics, but from competitors who had seen La Lumiere's unique identity as a threat. It began subtly. A few negative reviews here and there, the kind that left more to interpretation than actual substance. A comment about the staff service being lackluster, a complaint about how long it took to be seated. At first, they shrugged it off. After all, no restaurant could satisfy everyone, right? But as the weeks went by, the pattern started to emerge. It wasn't random, it was coordinated. Victor was the first to notice it. One evening, as he sat in his office, he found a series of similar reviews flooding in from multiple platforms, all focusing on the same minor issues. They all sounded eerily similar, as if they were written by the same person or group. He sat back in his chair, frowning. Clara was right. The restaurant was doing better than ever, but with that success came a new breed of problems. The competition in the city was fierce, and some were willing to go to extreme lengths to tear down their rising star. The next day, Victor called a meeting with the team. The atmosphere was tense as they gathered in the back room. Everyone knew something was off, but nobody knew exactly what. Clara sat across from Victor, exchanging glances with the team. Everyone had been on edge lately, feeling the weight of increasing pressure. "I've been looking over some reviews," Victor began, his voice low and serious. "And I'm starting to see a pattern. These aren't just typical negative reviews. They're focused on very specific things that we know we've been improving. Our service, the wait times, things that haven't been issues for us in a while." Clara nodded. "Are we sure it's not just the usual kind of complaints?" Victor shook his head. "No, this feels different. I think we're being targeted." There was a collective pause in the room as everyone absorbed what he was saying. Mia was the first to speak up. "Do you think it's the competition?" she asked, her voice tight with frustration. "I do," Victor replied, looking at each of them in turn. "And that's why we need to be careful. We can't let this affect the way we work, the way we treat each other. We need to stay focused on what we can control." Clara leaned forward, her voice resolute. "We've been through tougher things. We'll get through this too. But we need to stay unified. The moment we let this tear us apart, that's when we lose." Over the next few days, the negative reviews continued to pile in. They were more pointed now, even more personal. People started to question the restaurant's ethics, its business practices. Rumors spread that La Lumiere was just a flash in the pan, that it was built on hype and would soon be forgotten. The staff was feeling the strain. Some of the newer members were especially vulnerable, doubting themselves and the work they had put into turning La Lumiere into something extraordinary. The energy was different now. It wasn't just pressure to succeed. It was pressure to survive. Victor and Clara had their work cut out for them. They spent hours going over feedback, ensuring the team stayed focused on the positive. But the negativity was starting to seep in, affecting morale. It was one particularly tough afternoon when Clara sat down with Carlos, who had been one of the first to join the restaurant's new vision. His once buoyant energy was now muted, his face drawn with worry. "Carlos, you okay?" Clara asked, sitting down next to him. She could see the stress etched on his face. Carlos let out a long sigh, rubbing his temples. "It's hard to keep up the positivity, Clara. The reviews, they're everywhere. Some people don't even give us a chance. They just want to tear us down." Clara nodded, understanding. "I know, but we can't let those reviews define us. We're better than that." Carlos looked up at her, a flicker of doubt in his eyes. "But what if it's not just the reviews? What if we've reached the peak? What if it's all downhill from here?" Clara's heart tightened. She had heard the same fears echo from other team members. It was one thing to face challenges from outside the restaurant, but it was something else entirely to see that fear creeping inside the team. "We're not done yet," she said firmly, putting a reassuring hand on his arm. "We've been through worse. We've already overcome more than anyone thought possible. And we're going to keep going, not just because of the restaurant, but because of each other." The weeks dragged on, and the situation at La Lumiere grew more complicated. The negative press wasn't slowing down. In fact, it was intensifying. Victor and Clara tried to combat the false narratives with their own positive outreach, social media posts, interviews with local news outlets, even public community events. But the damage had been done. The whispers about La Lumiere's downfall had already taken root. It was late one evening when the final straw came. Clara walked into the dining room after the last customer had left, only to find Victor standing near the front window, his face grim. "I just got off the phone with our supplier," he said quietly. "They've been getting calls, people trying to discredit us, saying we're unethical. They're pulling their support." Clara's stomach dropped. The moment they had been dreading had arrived. This wasn't just about online reviews anymore. The very foundation of La Lumière was being attacked. Victor turned to her, his expression filled with resolve. "We're not going down without a fight, Clara. We've worked too hard for this, and we've got the community behind us. We can't let a few bad actors tear it all down." Clara nodded, her resolve matching his. "We're in this together. We've come too far to let it slip away now." As they stood there, staring out at the empty restaurant, both Clara and Victor understood something critical. The real challenge wasn't in facing the competition or the negative reviews. It was in remembering who they were and why they had started this journey in the first place. And they weren't about to let that slip away. The following days at La Lumière were a blur. It seemed as though every corner the team turned, there was another hurdle to overcome. Suppliers had started pulling their orders. The media was no longer shining a positive light on the restaurant, and whispers of a scandal had begun circulating within the city's food community. The weight of the attacks on their reputation was crushing. Clara could feel the strain in every conversation, every meeting, and every interaction. But through it all, Clara refused to let herself fall into despair. She spent sleepless nights alongside Victor, brainstorming ways to fight back, ways to remind their supporters why they had fought so hard to create a space like La Lumière in the first place. They both knew that they needed more than just a response to the negativity. They needed to reclaim their story, to rewrite the narrative. The breakthrough came unexpectedly. One evening, as Clara was preparing for a late-night meeting with her management team, she received an email. It was from Angela, a former customer who had been a regular at La Lumière ever since the new direction had been set. Angela had left a glowing review back when things were thriving. Clara remembered her as a passionate and loyal patron, someone who had shared the restaurant's success on social media and told her friends all about La Lumière's mission to create an inclusive and welcoming atmosphere. But this email wasn't a typical thank you note. Angela had written at length about her experience, not just as a customer, but as someone who had come to understand what La Lumière truly stood for. She spoke about how the restaurant had become a safe haven for people who felt overlooked by mainstream establishments, how its transformation had made her feel more connected to the community, and how she had seen the team struggle and rise despite the challenges. Angela closed the email with a powerful message. "Don't let them tear you down. The truth is bigger than their lies. The people who matter know who you are." Clara sat back, the weight of Angela's words hitting her deeply. She didn't realize until that moment just how much La Lumière had impacted people. This wasn't just about food or reviews. It was about the people they had inspired, the lives they had touched. She picked up the phone and dialed Victor's number, urgency in her voice when he answered. "Victor, we've been going about this all wrong," she said, her mind racing with the idea that had just formed. "We've been fighting the negativity. We've been reacting. But what if instead of letting them control the narrative, we tell our story? We show people who we are?" Victor's voice was steady on the other end. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking it's time for us to be transparent. It's time to take our community into our confidence. We need to show them who we are, not just as a restaurant, but as people. Let's host an event. Let's bring everyone in, the staff, the customers, the community, and let them hear from us directly. Let them see the heart behind everything we've done." Victor was quiet for a moment, and Clara could almost hear him considering the idea. "You think they'll show up? After everything that's happened?" "I know they will," Clara said, her voice filled with conviction. "We've already built something real. We've connected with people who care about us. Now we just have to remind them that the heart of La Lumière hasn't changed. The food is just part of the story. The people, the family we've built, is the real story." The next few days were a whirlwind of planning. Clara and Victor worked together to organize an event that would do just what Clara had envisioned. Bring their supporters together, hear from the community, and put a face to the story behind La Lumière. They called it the Heart of La Lumière, a chance for the staff to meet their customers, for regulars to share their experiences, and for Clara and Victor to publicly reaffirm their commitment to the values they had fought so hard to establish. As the event approached, Clara felt a shift in the air. There was still fear, still uncertainty, but there was also a growing sense of anticipation. They had become a symbol, not just of a restaurant, but of resilience and authenticity. And now, It was time to prove that they weren't backing down. The night of the event, the restaurant buzzed with energy. The tables were filled with familiar faces, loyal patrons, community leaders, former critics, and curious newcomers who had come to see what La Lumiere was really about. The air was thick with conversation and laughter, but there was an underlying sense of hope, like everyone was waiting for something. Victor and Clara stood at the front of the room, their hearts beating in unison. They had already made their rounds, greeting guests, catching up with friends, but now it was time. Time to step forward and take control of their narrative. Clara took a deep breath and stepped up to the mic. "Thank you all for being here tonight," Clara began, her voice steady but full of emotion. "This restaurant has always been about more than just the food. It's about creating a space where people feel welcome, where they feel seen, and where they can share not just a meal, but a moment. Over the past few months, we've been through some tough times. We've faced challenges that none of us could have anticipated. But through it all, we've learned something powerful. We've learned that the most important thing we have is the trust and support of this community." She paused, looking out at the faces in the crowd. There were nods, smiles, and even a few tears from people who had supported them since the beginning. "We know that some of you have heard the rumors, the negativity. But let me be clear, that's not who we are. We are not defined by the opinions of those who seek to tear us down. We are defined by our values. We are defined by the love and care we put into every meal we serve, and the respect we give to every person who walks through our doors. And tonight, we want to celebrate that. We want to celebrate the real La Lumiere, the heart of it all." The crowd erupted in applause, and Clara felt the weight of the past few weeks lift from her shoulders. It wasn't just words, it was truth. The truth that had brought them this far. As the night wore on, Clara and Victor watched as the room filled with warmth and connection. Old friends shared stories, new customers were introduced to the staff, and the air was alive with energy. It was the kind of night that La Lumiere had always been about, a reminder that community wasn't just a concept, but a living, breathing thing that could weather any storm. When the event came to a close, Clara and Victor stood together near the entrance, watching as the last of their guests filtered out. "This is just the beginning, isn't it?" Victor said softly. Clara smiled, her eyes shining with a mix of exhaustion and pride. "It is, and we're going to make it through. Not because we're perfect, but because we're real. And that's what matters." The aftermath of The Heart of La Lumiere event was more than Clara and Victor had hoped for. The feedback was overwhelmingly positive. Not only had they reconnected with their loyal community, but they had also gained new supporters who respected their openness and commitment to transparency. People who had once been skeptical now came forward with apologies, eager to help spread the truth about La Lumiere. Despite the victory, Clara knew that this wasn't the end of their battle. The damage had been done. The competition would still be out there, trying to sabotage their hard-earned reputation. But what had become clear to her was that no matter how many times they were knocked down, their community would be there to lift them up. The first few days after the event were filled with a sense of relief, but also a quiet resolve. The team was energized, yes, but they also knew that the true work had just begun. Clara and Victor spent long hours in the back office, planning how to move forward. They were already starting to see more positive reviews trickle in, but they couldn't afford to rest on their laurels. They had to stay vigilant, proactive, and most importantly, true to themselves. The restaurant's leadership team, which now included key staff members like Mia and Carlos, came together for a strategy session one morning. Clara stood at the head of the table, feeling the weight of their collective effort. "We've made a strong comeback, but we need a sustainable path forward," Clara said, her voice calm but determined. "We can't just survive on goodwill. We need to prove that we can keep doing what we do best, and do it even better." Mia nodded. "I think we've built something really special. People love the community feel here. I think we should lean into that more. Maybe more interactive events, things that really make our patrons feel like they're part of the family." Victor added, "I agree. We've already got a loyal base, but we can always deepen those relationships. We could bring back some of our old community events, like charity dinners and neighborhood meetups. People need to see we're here for the long haul." Carlos, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. "And we need to keep our staff motivated. It's been a tough few months, and even though we're feeling better now, we can't let the pressure cause burnout again. Let's do regular check-ins with everyone, see how they're doing, and make sure we're giving them room to grow, too." Clara smiled, feeling a wave of gratitude for her team. "Exactly. We've been through a lot, and now we're stronger because of it. We have to keep remembering that this restaurant is not just about food. It's about the people we serve and the people we work with. That's what makes La Lumiere stand out. That's what will keep us moving forward." As the weeks passed, the changes began to take shape. La Lumiere hosted its first charity dinner since the crisis, which raised funds for a local nonprofit dedicated to supporting underprivileged communities. The event was packed, and Clara saw firsthand how much the community appreciated their commitment to giving back. There were no critics hiding behind fake usernames. Just people, together, united by a cause. The team also began implementing small, but impactful changes within the restaurant. Mia's idea for interactive events gained traction, and soon, La Lumiere was hosting regular cooking classes with the chefs, offering wine tastings with local sommeliers, and even arranging casual, meet the farmer evenings where customers could interact directly with the sources of their ingredients. These new offerings gave the restaurant a fresh energy, and soon, word spread, not only about the food, but about the experience that La Lumiere now provided. One day, as Clara walked through the bustling restaurant floor during a busy lunch service, she couldn't help but stop for a moment and just observe. She saw the team in action. Carlos greeting customers with a smile, Mia laughing with a regular, and the new faces of the kitchen staff working seamlessly together. She felt a quiet pride in everything they had rebuilt. Victor appeared beside her, as if sensing her thoughts. He smiled, his eyes reflecting the same pride. "This is it, Clara. We're back," he said. Clara nodded, a soft laugh escaping her lips. "I think we're better than before." Just then, a familiar face walked through the door. Clara's heart skipped a beat when she saw Angela, the woman who had sent the email that had sparked their turnaround. Angela's face lit up when she saw Clara, and she made her way over to the hostess stand. "Clara, it's good to see you," Angela said warmly. Clara embraced her, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. "I'm so glad you came. You've helped us more than you know." Angela smiled, her eyes sparkling. "I always knew you'd make it through. You've built something incredible here. I wanted to come by and show my support in person." "I can't tell you how much that means to us," Clara said. "This place, this whole journey, wouldn't be the same without people like you." Angela looked around the restaurant, her smile never fading. "This is what a community looks like, and you've created it." As the months passed, La Lumiere's reputation began to rebuild itself, but this time, it wasn't just about food. It wasn't just about a restaurant. It was about a family, the kind of family that sticks together through thick and thin. And, perhaps most importantly, it was about staying true to the values they had fought for from the beginning. The competition, although still lurking in the background, was no longer a threat. The city had begun to realize that La Lumiere was more than just a business. It was a symbol of resilience, of community, and of authenticity. One evening, as Clara sat alone in the restaurant after hours, she reflected on everything that had happened. She thought about the late nights, the doubt, the pressure, but also about the triumphs, the moments of hope, and the people who had never given up on La Lumiere. Victor joined her, as he often did after the final shift. "Anything on your mind?" he asked. Clara smiled, looking around at the now empty tables. "I was just thinking about how far we've come, from where we started, to everything we've been through. I can't believe we made it." Victor chuckled softly. "You mean we made it through all that?" He gestured vaguely to the empty restaurant, referring to everything that had nearly torn them apart. Clara leaned back in her chair, her voice filled with conviction. "We didn't just survive. We thrived. And we're going to keep thriving, because we've built something real here. Not just a restaurant. A place that matters. A place where people belong." Victor looked at her with admiration. "And we'll keep building it. Together." The momentum La Lumiere had gained from its recovery wasn't simply a flash of success. It was the spark that ignited a deeper transformation, one that would forever change the course of the restaurant's journey. But as the restaurant continued to thrive and the community's support grew stronger, Clara and Victor knew that maintaining the balance would be the true test. The city, for all its charm and potential, was always changing, and so were the demands of its food scene. Trends were evolving, and La Lumiere had already been through one revolution. Would they be able to adapt once again, this time without losing the heart of what made them unique? Clara found herself reflecting more often in these days of quiet success. She'd walk through the restaurant, surveying the faces of both familiar and new customers, and there was a part of her that felt a familiar unease, the kind of nagging feeling that came before big changes. Victor noticed it too. One night, as they walked through the back office after a busy service, he turned to Clara. "You've been quieter than usual. Everything all right?" Clara paused, then slowly met his gaze. "I've been thinking. We're doing great now, but there's this nagging thought. Things won't stay the same forever, right? The landscape of the restaurant world changes so quickly. It's been a while since we've done something bold." Victor furrowed his brow. "Bold? We've been through so much, Clara. We've already reinvented ourselves once. Are you saying we need another one?" "I'm not sure," Clara admitted, "but I'm wondering if we need to push the boundaries again. I mean, it's the reason we got to this point in the first place. We can't just let La Lumiere become the place that recovered. We need to keep reinventing ourselves without losing what makes us who we are. Or someone else will." Victor paused, mulling over her words. "All right then, what's the next step?" Clara smiled slightly. "That's the million-dollar question." In the following weeks, Clara and Victor began to strategize. They knew that their success wasn't just about perfect food and customer service anymore. The restaurant had become a cultural icon, known for its spirit, its inclusivity, and the community it fostered. But they couldn't rest on that alone. Together with their team, they started brainstorming new concepts. They dove into customer feedback, looking for new ways to engage their guests, as well as creative innovations in the kitchen. Clara was particularly interested in exploring sustainability. La Lumiere had always championed local ingredients, but what if they could take it a step further? They considered farm-to-table programs, zero-waste initiatives, and even introducing an educational component to showcase their dedication to environmental responsibility. The challenge, however, was balancing innovation with authenticity. As much as they wanted to move forward, Clara was determined not to lose the essence of La Lumiere, the warm, welcoming atmosphere that had always been at the heart of their mission. It couldn't just be about the next big thing. It had to be about remaining grounded in the values that had brought them here. The decision was made. La Lumiere would embark on a small-scale experiment, a new menu concept that blended the best of what they had always done with a bold exploration of sustainability. Clara and Victor spent days in the kitchen, talking with their chefs and suppliers, sketching out the blueprint for what would eventually become La Lumiere's sustainability series. It was to be an exclusive offering, rotating menu of dishes inspired by seasonal ingredients, prepared with eco-conscious techniques, and paired with storytelling about the producers and farmers who grew the food. This was about creating an experience, not just a meal. They also began planning a community event that would coincide with the launch. They'd invite their most loyal customers, local environmentalists, and culinary influencers to experience the sustainability series firsthand. The event would showcase their new commitment to a sustainable future while celebrating the resilience of La Lumiere's journey. The day of the launch arrived, and Clara was both excited and nervous. She stood near the front of the restaurant, taking in the bustle of activity as the team prepared for the evening's big event. The restaurant was decorated with lush plants, hand-painted signs showcasing the new menu, and sustainable materials that fit the theme. Clara was proud. This was the new chapter, the evolution of La Lumiere, but she still felt the weight of responsibility on her shoulders. Victor walked up beside her, offering a reassuring smile. "We've got this." Clara nodded, but her mind was still racing. She caught a glimpse of Carlos in the kitchen, double-checking the prep, and Mia chatting with the staff at the host stand. She knew they were ready, but what if the community wasn't ready for the change? "You think they'll like it?" Clara asked, her voice low, filled with the vulnerability of a leader who had put everything on the line. Victor looked at her with a quiet confidence. "They'll love it. We've already shown them who we are. We just need to trust in that. We're not changing the heart of La Lumiere. We're just showing them what else we can be." The doors opened, and the guests began to filter in. The energy was electric as Clara watched the customers react to the new atmosphere, the new menu, and the care that had gone into every detail. As the night unfolded, she could see the excitement in their eyes. The dishes were met with enthusiastic applause. Each course was a conversation piece, with guests asking questions about the sustainable practices behind the ingredients, the stories of the farmers, and the inspiration behind the dishes. And then, just when Clara thought it couldn't get any better, Angela appeared at the door, a broad smile on her face. "I told you," Angela said as she embraced Clara. "This place is magic. You're doing it. You're evolving, but you're staying true to your soul. It's like you've found the perfect balance." Clara smiled, the weight of her doubts finally lifting. She looked around at the room, at the community she had worked so hard to rebuild, the people who had stood by them. This wasn't just a restaurant anymore. This was a movement. And tonight, they had proven that they were ready for whatever came next. As the night drew to a close, and the last of the guests had left, Clara and Victor stood side by side, taking in the quiet calm that had settled over La Lumiere. "We did it," Clara whispered, more to herself than to Victor. Victor chuckled. "We've been doing it all along. Just didn't know it yet." Clara looked around at the now empty dining room, a sense of peace washing over her. It wasn't just about the food or the reviews anymore. It was about building something that would last, something that mattered to people. And La Lumiere had proven that no matter how much the world around them changed, as long as they stayed true to who they were, they could face whatever came their way. The weeks following the successful launch of the sustainability series were nothing short of transformative for La Lumiere. The event had proven more than just a creative pivot for the restaurant. It was a declaration of who they had become, who they were, and who they were determined to be moving forward. Clara and Victor could sense it in every conversation they had, in every exchange with their customers. La Lumiere wasn't just a place to eat anymore. It had become a living, breathing example of resilience, reinvention, and community. And though Clara had often found herself doubting the future in the past, she now saw it before her in a bright new light. One chilly morning, as Clara sat at her usual spot near the front window, sipping her coffee and watching the city come alive, she felt an overwhelming sense of peace. It had taken so much effort to get here, to navigate through every challenge, every obstacle. But now, it was clear. The path ahead was wide open. Victor joined her, coffee in hand, and they exchanged a knowing smile. For the first time in a long while, there was no looming pressure, no fear of the unknown. There was only quiet satisfaction in their accomplishments. "So, what's next?" Victor asked, taking a seat across from Clara. Clara thought for a moment before answering. "I think we've done what we set out to do. We reinvented ourselves, but we stayed true to our roots. We didn't compromise our values." Victor nodded thoughtfully. "We've built something special here, Clara. Something that's not just about the food, but about the people. And I think that's the future we've always wanted." Clara smiled. "I think you're right. I guess what's next is just continuing to evolve, staying open to the future while remembering where we came from. Let's keep listening, learning, and growing." As Clara said those words, she realized something important. They were no longer reacting to the changes around them. They were shaping the future. They were ready to embrace it, to lead it, without losing what mattered most. That afternoon, Clara and Victor sat down to meet with the rest of their leadership team. The meeting was filled with excitement and positivity as they discussed ways to continue pushing the boundaries without straying too far from the restaurant's original vision. "We've seen how well the sustainability series is doing," Mia said. "I think we should take it a step further. We could start doing pop-up events at local markets, partnering with more sustainable brands. People love the story behind the food. It's time we take that story to them." Carlos, who had become an integral part of the team, chimed in. "And we could use our platform to support more local artists and environmentalists. I've seen some incredible talent in the community, and it would be a great way to give back." Victor leaned forward, his eyes lighting up with the possibilities. "These are exactly the kinds of things that keep us relevant. We're not just a restaurant anymore. We're a platform, a hub for connection." Clara nodded. "I love where this is going. But let's not lose sight of why we started in the first place. It's about community. Everything we do needs to build that sense of belonging. We need to keep that spirit alive. There was a moment of collective agreement around the table. It was clear they were more than ready to take on whatever challenges lay ahead. A few months later, La Lumiere's reach had expanded beyond their local community. The restaurant's new direction, focused on sustainability, inclusivity, and artistry, had struck a chord with not just their loyal patrons, but with people who were drawn to their authenticity and commitment to positive change. The pop-up events and partnerships with local artisans had not only created new revenue streams, but had also brought La Lumiere further into the spotlight. But perhaps the most rewarding moment came when La Lumiere was invited to speak at a major culinary conference, one where they could share their journey with an audience of industry leaders, innovators, and other chefs. It was a rare opportunity to influence the broader restaurant world and show them how a restaurant could thrive by staying true to its values, even in the face of adversity. As Clara stood at the podium, addressing the packed room, she found herself reflecting on the entire journey. From the early days of struggle, the misunderstandings, the sabotage, to the moment she had nearly given up. Everything had led to this moment. She wasn't just a survivor anymore. She was a leader. "What I've learned," Clara said, her voice steady and clear, "is that success doesn't come from perfection. It comes from honesty, from resilience, from the willingness to reinvent, adapt, and evolve without ever losing sight of what makes you who you are." The audience sat in rapt attention, absorbing every word. Clara continued, her passion building with every sentence. "We didn't build La Lumiere to be a trend. We built it to be a home, a place where people can find themselves, where they can belong. And that's the future we're committed to. A future where we not only serve food, but serve love, connection, and purpose." As the conference ended, Clara and Victor stood side by side, feeling an overwhelming sense of pride. The journey had taken them places they had never imagined, but it had also brought them back to the heart of what truly mattered. Back at La Lumiere, the restaurant was thriving. The community was more united than ever, with new faces joining the ranks of regulars, and the team was closer than it had ever been. They had created something that wasn't just a business, it was a movement. And now, as Clara looked out at the bustling dining room, she knew that their work was far from over. But she also knew this. They had built something that was stronger than any storm they had faced before. It was more than just a restaurant. It was a legacy, and it was only just beginning.